Hey everyone, and welcome back to the deepest part of the night. Make sure you're comfortable and fully settled in for a long one. Tonight, we're blending the soothing sound of the rain with unsettling and chilling stories, so you can truly let go and relax. If this mix of calm and unease feels like your kind of escape, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss more long, rainy nights of narrative dread. Also, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is right now. Now, let the rain surround you, and allow the stories to pull you into the night. Story 1. I was down to my last $40 and a pack of stale cigarettes when I saw the ad. It was taped to a lamppost outside a bodega in a part of Detroit that even the cops didn't like to patrol after dark. Night security. Immediate start. Cash pay. No questions. The number was written in black marker. Any sane person would have kept walking. A job posting on a lamppost usually means you're going to be muling drugs or scrubbing crime scenes. But I wasn't sane. I was hungry, behind on rent, and desperate enough to ignore the warning bells ringing in my head. I called the number. A voice that sounded like gravel crunching under tires gave me an address and a time, 10 p.m. Sharp. The location was a massive, sprawling warehouse in the industrial district, surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with razor wire that looked brand new. The rest of the building, however, looked like it had been rotting since the assembly lines shut down in the 80s. Rust bled down the corrugated metal siding like dried blood. I met the foreman at the gate. His name was Mr. Henderson, a man whose skin was so pale it looked translucent, stretching tight over a skull that seemed too large for his face. He didn't shake my hand. He didn't ask for a resume. He just handed me a flashlight, a heavy ring of keys, and a laminated sheet of paper. "The shift is 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., he said, his voice flat, devoid of any human inflection. "Do not leave the perimeter. Do not let anyone in. And most importantly, follow the rules on the sheet. To the letter. If you break a rule, I cannot guarantee your severance pay. Or your safety." He unlocked the gate, ushered me into the guard booth, a small plexiglass box sitting in the center of the main warehouse floor, and left. I watched his taillights fade into the darkness, leaving me alone in a space big enough to house 3 football fields, filled with rows of shipping containers stacked 3 high. I sat in the swivel chair, the smell of old oil and damp cardboard filling my nose, and looked at the laminated sheet. I expected standard security protocols: check the locks, log the patrols, call 911 in case of fire. Instead, I read the following. Rules for night shift warehouse 4. Patrols must be conducted every hour on the hour. Do not deviate from the marked path. If you hear the sound of a dog barking from inside a shipping container, do not investigate. We do not store animals. The break room is on the east wall. If you see a vending machine in the corner, do not use it. Do not look at the selection. Walk away immediately. There is no vending machine in this warehouse. If the phone in the booth rings, count the rings. If it rings 3 times, answer it. If it rings twice, let it go to voicemail. If it rings once and stops, get under the desk and close your eyes until you hear the front gate alarm chirp. Between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m., avoid the mirrors in the employee bathroom. If you must enter, keep your head down. Your reflection will not be yours during this hour. If you see a man in a yellow raincoat standing in the aisles, do not acknowledge him. Do not speak to him. Do not shine your light on him. Walk past him as if he is not there. He is just observing. I laughed. I actually laughed out loud, the sound echoing sharply in the vast, empty metal cavern. "Okay, hazing the new guy," I muttered, tossing the sheet onto the desk. "Very funny." I figured Henderson and his buddies were probably watching on cameras, waiting for me to freak out. I decided to play it cool. I'd do the job, collect the cash, and ignore the spooky nonsense. The first 2 hours were uneventful. I walked the perimeter, my flashlight cutting through the thick, dusty air. The silence in the warehouse was heavy, broken only by the settling of the metal roof and the distant hum of the city. But around midnight the atmosphere changed. The air grew colder, dropping 10 degrees in seconds. I was sitting in the booth when I heard it. A bark. Deep, guttural, aggressive. It was coming from container 402, a red steel box about 50 feet away. My instinct was to check. It sounded like a big dog, maybe trapped or left behind. I stood up, grabbing the keys. Then I remembered Rule 2. We do not store animals. I hesitated. The barking changed. It shifted from a dog's bark into a rough, rhythmic coughing sound, and then into a voice mimicking a bark. Woof! A deep, human voice said from inside the container. Woof! Woof! It was mocking me. The hair on my arms stood up. I sat back down, turning up the volume on my portable radio, drowning out the sound. I didn't investigate. At 1 a.m., I went for my patrol. I was thirsty, so I headed toward the break room on the east wall to use the water fountain. I pushed open the door and froze. In the corner, glowing with a soft, humming neon light, was a vintage vending machine. It looked pristine, out of place against the peeling paint of the break room walls. Inside, the coils held snacks I didn't recognize, wrappers with text that looked like Cyrillic but shifted when I tried to focus on them. A bag of chips seemed to be breathing. I felt an intense, overwhelming urge to buy something. I had change in my pocket. I took a step forward, my hand reaching for a quarter. Rule 3. I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted blood to break the trance. It's not real, I whispered. I turned around and walked out, my heart pounding. When I glanced back as the door swung shut, the corner was empty. Just dust and shadows. The real terror started at 2:45 a.m. The phone rang. Ring. I reached for it. Ring. I paused, hand hovering over the receiver. I waited for the third ring. Silence. It had rung twice. Rule 4. I pulled my hand back as if the phone were red hot. Seconds later, the voicemail light started blinking furiously. I didn't play the message. I didn't want to know who calls a warehouse at 3 a.m. and leaves a message after 2 rings. Then came the patrol. I had to do it. If I didn't, Henderson might dock my pay, or worse. I walked down the long central aisle, the spine of the warehouse. The rows of containers towered over me like skyscrapers, creating a canyon of steel. I was halfway down, near the section marked hazardous materials, when I saw him. Standing dead center in the aisle, about 30 yards ahead, was a figure. He was wearing a bright yellow raincoat, the kind fishermen wear, with the hood pulled up. He was facing away from me. I stopped dead. My breath caught in my throat. Rule 6. Do not acknowledge him, I repeated in my head. Walk past him. I forced my legs to move. I kept my flashlight beam pointed strictly at the floor, avoiding his figure. As I got closer, the smell hit me, ozone and sulfur, like a lightning strike mixed with rotten eggs. I walked steadily, my boots crunching on the concrete. I was 10 feet away. 5 feet. I could hear him dripping. There was no rain, but water was cascading off his coat, pooling around his boots. As I passed him, I made the mistake of looking at his shadow. The light from the high bay windows cast his shadow to my left. But the shadow wasn't wearing a coat. The shadow looked like a mass of writhing, spiky limbs, like a spider made of smoke. And then he spoke. He didn't turn around, but his voice was right in my ear, whispering wetly. Jack, he whispered. He knew my name. Look at me. I have something to show you. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to shine the light on him, to scream. I bit my tongue so hard I felt a piece of it sever. I swallowed the blood and kept walking. Left foot, right foot. Don't stop. Don't look. Jack, the voice hissed, now sounding angry. I can see your heart beating. I walked until I reached the end of the aisle, turned the corner, and only then did I collapse against the container, gasping for air. I didn't look back. I knew he was still there, observing. The rest of the night was a blur of paranoia. 3 a.m. to 4 a.m. was the hardest. I needed to use the bathroom, but I remembered Rule 5. I held it. I sat in the booth, staring at the floor, refusing to look at the glass of the window, terrified I might see a reflection that wasn't mine. At 3:30 a.m. I heard tapping on the glass of the booth. Gentle, rhythmic tapping. Tap, tap, tap. Then a pause. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from all four sides of the booth at once. I closed my eyes and hummed a song from my childhood, rocking back and forth until the sun began to bleed through the high windows, turning the gray warehouse into a dusty gold. At 6 a.m. sharp, the gate buzzed. Mr. Henderson drove in. He looked exactly the same as the night before, same pale skin, same dead eyes. I handed him the keys and the flashlight. My hands were shaking uncontrollably. "Any issues?" he asked, not looking at me, but checking the logbook where I had scribbled all clear every hour with a trembling hand. "No," I lied. "Quiet night." He paused, looking up at me for the first time. A small, cruel smile played on his lips. "Good. Most don't make it past the man in yellow. They look. Curiosity kills more than just cats, Jack." He handed me an envelope thick with cash. "See you tonight?" I looked at the money. It was more than I had made in the last 3 months combined. I looked at the warehouse, at the dark corners where the shadows still clung. I thought about the voice in the container. I thought about the vending machine. And I thought about my empty fridge and the eviction notice taped to my apartment door. "Yeah," I said, my voice hollow. "See you tonight." I walked to the bus stop in the morning light, feeling the weight of the cash in my pocket. I got on the bus and sat near the back. As the bus pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror mounted above the driver's head to check if anyone was behind me. In the mirror, the bus was empty. But I wasn't. My reflection was sitting there, staring back at me. But it wasn't me. The reflection was smiling a wide, toothy grin that stretched too far across its face, and its eyes were solid black. It winked at me. I looked away, heart hammering. I realized then that I might have survived the night, but I hadn't left the rules behind. Or maybe, just maybe, I looked in a mirror during the 3 a.m. hour without realizing it, and the thing on the bus wasn't my reflection, it was the owner of the body I was now inhabiting. I closed my eyes and didn't open them until I got home. I have to go back tonight. I have to. Because I think the only way to get my reflection back is to ask the man in yellow where he put it. Story 2. The desert at night is not empty. It is merely holding its breath. That's what old-timers say about the stretch of Highway 50 through Nevada. The loneliest road in America. I've driven it 100 times in my rig, hauling everything from frozen poultry to industrial machinery. I know every curve, every dip, every lonely mile marker. Or at least I thought I did. My name is Miller, and I drive a Peterbilt 389, a beast of a truck that's been my home more often than my actual apartment in Reno. I'm a creature of habit. Coffee at the Jagged Edge Diner in Ely, fill up at the station in Eureka, and then the long, dark haul across the basin to Fallon. Just me, the hum of the diesel, and the static of the CB radio. It was 2 a.m. on a Tuesday. The moon was a sliver of bone in a sky so black it looked like velvet. I was making good time, cruising at 70, the headlights carving a tunnel of light through the sagebrush. I hadn't seen another car for 2 hours. The isolation usually comforted me, but tonight, the silence felt pressurized. The radio was dead, not just quiet, but dead. No chatter, no static, just a low, oscillating hum that set my teeth on edge. I saw him standing near mile marker 77. A hitchhiker. In the middle of the Great Basin, 50 miles from the nearest town, standing on the gravel shoulder. He wasn't thumbing a ride. He was just standing there, arms at his sides, staring straight ahead at the asphalt. He wore a faded denim jacket and jeans, nondescript, like every drifter I'd ever seen. But something about his posture was wrong. Too rigid. Like a mannequin dropped on the roadside. I don't pick up hitchhikers. Company policy and common sense. But as I roared past him, the backdraft of the trailer should have ruffled his clothes, maybe made him stumble. I checked my side mirror. He hadn't moved. He hadn't flinched. He was just a statue in the red glow of my taillights. A shiver crawled down my spine, cold and sharp. I shook it off, turned up the heater, and reached for my thermos. "Just a crazy," I muttered. "Desert's full of them." I drove for another hour. By my calculations, I should have been seeing the lights of Austin, the next town, cresting the horizon. But the horizon remained pitch black. The odometer clicked steadily. 456,789. 456,790. I checked the GPS on the dash. No signal. Just a spinning circle. Searching for satellites. Annoying, but not unheard of out here. Then I saw him again. Mile marker 77. I slammed on the brakes, the air brakes hissing violently as the truck shuddered to a halt. The smell of burning rubber filled the cab. I stared out the windshield. There he was. The same man. Same denim jacket. Same rigid posture. Same spot on the gravel shoulder. It was impossible. I had been driving west at 70 miles per hour for 60 minutes. I should be 70 miles away. "Okay," I said aloud, my voice sounding too loud in the cab. "Okay, Miller. You're tired. You're seeing things. Highway hypnosis." I grabbed the CB mic. "Breaker 19, this is Big Rig Miller. Anyone copy?" Over. Silence. Then a crackle. Not a voice, but a sound. Click, click, click. Like someone tapping a fingernail on a microphone. "This is Miller. I think I'm turned around near mile marker 77. Need a comm check." The radio hissed. Then a voice cut through, clear as ice water. It was my voice. "Just a crazy. Desert's full of them." My blood turned to slush. That was what I had said to myself an hour ago. In the privacy of the cab. Not on the radio. I threw the mic down. What the hell? I put the truck in gear. I had to move. I had to get away from that figure on the side of the road. I floored it, the engine roaring as I sped past him again. I didn't look in the mirror this time. I kept my eyes glued to the white lines. The road stretched on, straight as an arrow. 30 minutes later. Mile marker 77. He was there. But this time, he had moved. He wasn't on the shoulder. He was standing in the middle of the westbound lane. I swerved. I yanked the wheel hard to the left, the trailer fishtailing dangerously. The headlights swept over him. For a split second, I saw his face. It was smooth. No eyes. No nose. No mouth. Just the expanse of pale, fleshy skin where a face should be. I screamed, fighting the wheel to keep the rig from flipping. I corrected the skid, heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I looked in the mirror. He was standing in the middle of the road, facing the truck. And then he started to run. He didn't run like a human. He ran on all fours, his limbs bending at impossible angles, galloping like a distorted greyhound. And he was fast. He was keeping pace with the truck. I upshifted, pushing the pedal to the floor. The speedometer climbed. 75, 80, 85. The engine whined in protest. The thing in the mirror was gaining. I could see the pale blur of its face bobbing in the red taillights. "Come on, come on!" I yelled, slamming my hand on the dashboard. Suddenly, the radio crackled again. "Breaker 19. You can't leave, Miller. You haven't paid the toll." It wasn't my voice this time. It was a chorus of voices, men, women, children, speaking in unison. A flat, monotonic choir. I looked ahead. In the distance, I saw lights. Town lights. Austin. Relief washed over me so strong it made me dizzy. I was out. I was escaping the loop. I sped toward the lights, ignoring the thing chasing me. But as I got closer, the lights didn't resolve into street lamps or houses. They were fires. Small, controlled fires burning on the side of the road. And between the fires, standing in a line across the highway, were people. Dozens of them. All wearing denim jackets. all with smooth, featureless faces. They stood arm in arm, blocking the road. I slammed on the brakes. There was no way to stop a fully loaded rig in that distance. I was going to plow through them. I blared the horn, a long, mournful blast that echoed into the night. They didn't move. They didn't flinch. I closed my eyes and braced for impact. Wham! The truck hit something, but it wasn't bodies. It felt like hitting a wall of water. The cab went dark. The engine died. The sensation of motion stopped instantly. I opened my eyes. Silence. Absolute, ringing silence. I was sitting in the driver's seat. The engine was off. The headlights were off. Outside, it was day. Bright, blinding sunlight. I looked around. I was parked on the shoulder of Highway 50. I looked at the mile marker. Mile marker 77. I scrambled out of the cab, my legs jelly. I fell onto the gravel, gasping for air. The desert was vast, empty, and silent under the midday sun. No fires. No faceless people. Just sagebrush and heat. I walked to the front of the truck. There was no damage. No blood. No sign of impact. Was it a dream? Did I fall asleep at the wheel and park? I checked my logbook. The last entry was at 1 a.m. in Eureka. My watch said it was 2 p.m. I had lost 12 hours. I got back in the truck, my hands shaking so bad I could barely turn the key. The engine roared to life. I turned on the radio, needing noise, any noise. Static. Then a voice. A DJ. And that's another beautiful afternoon here in the high desert. It's 2:15 p.m. on Tuesday. Up next, a classic for the long haulers. Music started playing. I put the truck in gear and pulled onto the highway. I drove slowly, checking every mile marker. 78, 79, 80. I started to breathe again. I cried a little, wiping tears with my greasy sleeve. I made it. I drove for another 10 miles. Then I saw it. On the passenger seat. A denim jacket. Folded neatly. I don't own a denim jacket. I stared at it, the blood draining from my face. I reached out and touched it. It was warm. I grabbed it to throw it out the window, and a piece of paper fell out of the pocket. I picked it up. It was a Polaroid photo. It was a picture of me, sleeping in the driver's seat of my truck, taken from outside the windshield, in the dark, and in the reflection of the glass, standing right next to the person taking the photo, was a face. My face. But it had no eyes, no mouth, just smooth skin. I'm still driving. I haven't stopped. I'm in Utah now, miles away from Nevada, but I can't stop shaking. I burned the jacket at a rest stop. I tore up the photo. But every time I look in the rearview mirror, just for a second, I see someone sitting in the sleeper berth behind me. He's wearing denim. And he's waiting for nightfall. Because the road doesn't end when you leave the highway. The road is in your head now. And the passenger never gets off. Story 3. There is a specific kind of darkness at 3,000 feet beneath the surface of the ocean. It isn't just an absence of light, it's a physical weight. It presses against the reinforced glass of your helmet, against the steel hull of the saturation chamber, against your very sanity. My name is Elias, and I was a saturation diver for Petrodyne, working on the Atlas rig in the Gulf of Mexico. We were the astronauts of the deep, living in a pressurized capsule for weeks at a time to avoid the lethal bends of daily surfacing. We were paid a fortune to fix pipes, weld struts, and ignore the primal instinct that screamed we didn't belong there. The job was routine, a structural repair on the jacket of the rig, specifically on pylon 4. The sensors were picking up stress fractures that didn't make sense on the schematics. My dive partner was a guy named Russo, a veteran who had spent more time breathing heliox, a mix of helium and oxygen, than fresh air. He was a rock. Nothing rattled him. Until the dive on November 14th. We dropped in the diving bell, a claustrophobic steel elevator lowered by a cable that felt miles long. As we descended, the water turned from azure to indigo, then to a black so profound it felt like we were falling into space. When the bell locked onto the depth, we equalized, and the hatch opened. The water temperature was near freezing, kept at bay only by the hot water pumped into our suits from the surface. "Radio check," I said. My voice sounded squeaky and cartoonish because of the helium, stripping away any gravity the situation might have had. "Read you 5x5, Elias." Topside control crackled in my ear. "Proceed to pylon 4. I stepped out of the bell and into the abyss. The umbilical, my lifeline for air, heat, and comms, trailed behind me. The lights on my helmet cut a narrow cone through the darkness, illuminating only swirling marine snow, the dead organic matter that falls endlessly to the ocean floor. I reached the pylon. The damage was worse than the report said. It wasn't a stress fracture. The steel, 3 inches thick, was bent inward. It looked like something had squeezed it. And there were gouges. Deep, serrated scratches running parallel to each other, stripping away the anti-corrosion coating. "Topside," I said, running my gloved hand over the scars. "This doesn't look like fatigue. It looks like impact damage." "Copy that. Can you weld a patch?" "Yeah. Starting now." I ignited the underwater torch. Bubbles and sparks erupted, blindingly bright against the black. I worked for 20 minutes, the rhythmic hissing of the torch the only sound. Then I felt it. A vibration. It wasn't the rig shaking. It was the water itself. A low-frequency thrum that resonated in my chest cavity. "Russo?" I called out. "You feel that?" Russo was 50 feet below me, inspecting the footing. "Feel what?" "The vibration. Like a hum." "Negative. My telemetry is clean." I went back to work, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. It's a common paranoia among divers, the eye of the deep. But this was specific. I felt like something was hovering just outside the range of my lights. I turned my head slowly to the left, scanning the void. Nothing. Just black water and the endless drift of snow. Then the snow stopped. It didn't hit the bottom. It just stopped falling in a specific area about 30 yards away, as if it had hit an invisible ceiling. Then the snow moved up. Currents don't do that down here. "Topside," I said, my voice trembling despite the helium. "I have movement." "Sector 3. We don't see anything on sonar, Elias." "You're clear." But I wasn't. 2 yellow lights flickered on in the distance. They were small, dim, like fireflies. They blinked. Once. Twice. Then they began to separate. They drifted apart, stretching wider and wider, until I realized they weren't 2 separate organisms. They were eyes. Eyes set on a head that was wider than a semi-truck. The creature was darker than the water, a massive shadow against the black. It had no bioluminescence other than those eyes. It drifted closer, silent as a cloud. "Russo! Get to the bell! Now!" I screamed. "What? Why? Move!" I abandoned the torch and swam hard for the bell, hauling on my umbilical. The vibration in the water spiked. It became a sound, a grinding, clicking noise like boulders being crushed together. Clack, clack, grind. I saw Russo below me. He had frozen. He was looking down, past his boots. "Elias," Russo whispered. "The floor, it's opening." I looked down. The ocean floor wasn't mud. It was a carpet of writhing, pale shapes. Eels? Worms? No. Tentacles. Thousands of them, erupting from the silt, reaching up toward Russo. "Swim, you idiot!" I yelled. Russo engaged his thrusters, but a thick, translucent tentacle whipped out of the darkness with terrifying speed. It wrapped around his ankle. There was no scream, just a sudden, violent jerk. Russo was pulled down. His umbilical pulled taut, vibrating. "Topside! Diver down! Emergency retract!" I screamed. The umbilical snapped. I saw the sparks fly as the cable severed. Russo's light spiraled down into the deep, spinning like a dying star, until it was swallowed by the shadow of the thing with the yellow eyes. I scrambled into the diving bell and slammed the hatch, spinning the locking wheel. "Pull me up! Pull me up!" The bell jerked as the winch engaged. We started to rise. I collapsed on the floor, gasping for air, staring at the thick glass of the viewport. We were rising, but not fast enough. Something hit the side of the bell. Clang. The steel groaned. I looked out the port. A massive, sucker-covered limb was wrapped around the bell. It was crushing the cage. I could hear the rivets popping like gunshots. Then the comms crackled. "Elias," a voice said. It wasn't topside. It wasn't Russo. It was my own voice. "Elias, open the hatch. The pressure is beautiful." I stared at the speaker. "Who is this?" "Open the hatch." The voice distorted, deepening into a guttural roar that shook the speaker from its mount. I curled into a ball, covering my ears, praying the winch held. The bell shook violently, swinging like a pendulum. The creature was trying to rip us off the line. Suddenly, there was a blinding flash of light outside. The rig's emergency strobe system had triggered. In that flash, I saw it. It wasn't an octopus. It wasn't a squid. It was a wall of flesh, ancient and scarred, covered in barnacles the size of cars. And in the center, a beak. A black, hook beak large enough to snap the diving bell in half. It snapped at the glass, leaving a deep scratch in the reinforced quartz. Then, we crossed the thermocline. The water temperature changed, and the creature let go. Maybe the pressure change was too much for it. Maybe it just wanted to play. The bell shot up, rocking wildly. I spent 3 days in the decompression chamber on the deck of the Atlas. They told me Russo had an equipment failure. They told me he panicked and cut his own line. They told me the damage to the bell was from hitting a pylon during the ascent. They lied. I quit diving. I moved to Nebraska, the furthest place from the ocean I could find. But I can't escape it. Because sometimes, when I'm in the shower, and the water hits my face, I hear it. That clicking, that grinding sound. And last week, I got a phone call. The caller ID was blocked. I answered. There was silence on the line for a moment. Then a voice, Russo's voice, but wet, bubbly, and distant. "Elias," he gurgled. "We fixed the pylon. But we ran out of air. Come back. The company needs you. It needs you." I hung up. I ripped the phone out of the wall. But I know the truth. They aren't drilling for oil out there. They're drilling to keep something fed. And they just ran out of appetizers. Story 4. The transfer order looked like a death warrant framed in cheap bureaucracy. My name is Connor Hayes, and after 8 years in the Coast Guard, I was tired of the relentless discipline and the endless movement. So, I took the civilian contractor job with the Lighthouse Preservation Society. My first assignment, Black Cliff Lantern, a massive, 150-year-old stone lighthouse perched on a desolate finger of granite jutting out into the Atlantic, 40 miles south of Bar Harbor, Maine. It was isolation, pure and simple, 3 months of solitude, maintaining the light, and logging the weather. It was supposed to be a reset. The boat ride out was hell. The waves were vicious, and the granite cliff face, sheer and dark, looked less like a beacon of safety and more like the fortress of something ancient and hungry. The lighthouse itself was a towering, silent monolith, 120 feet of cold, hard stone, its surface perpetually damp with salt spray. My predecessor, an old man named Silas, was waiting for me. He was pale, gaunt, and didn't look well. He didn't offer a handshake. He simply stared at me with eyes that seemed to have forgotten how to focus on anything in the present. "The log is current," he rasped, his voice sounding like dry sand rubbing against stone. "The light burns bright. But you have to listen to the fog, boy. It talks and it lies." He pointed a shaking finger at the stone walls of the cylindrical tower. "And don't look at the walls when the light is on. They watch." He was clearly unwell. I dismissed it as 3 months of profound, weather-induced solitude. I helped him onto the waiting boat, watched him leave, and turned to face my new, temporary home. The moment the boat's engine faded, the silence was overwhelming. It was a dense, heavy absence of sound, filled only by the relentless hiss of the ocean spray. The lightkeeper's quarters, a small, attached 2-story stone building, were functional but claustrophobic. My first task was a full structural check. I started at the bottom, the oil room, and began the long, winding ascent up the spiral staircase to the lantern room. The spiral staircase was the spine of the lighthouse, and it was here I found the initial, unsettling anomaly, the mark. The stone walls of the shaft were thick, cold, and dark gray. But every few feet, starting around the 10th step, there was a small, crudely carved etching in the stone. They weren't graffiti. They were all identical, a small, precise circle, about the size of a silver dollar, with 3 perfect, vertical lines drawn through the center, like a grotesque, simplified rendition of a man standing in a circle. I counted them. There were 119 of them, running the entire height of the shaft, spaced irregularly, as if they were made in moments of frantic compulsion. I reached the lantern room, a vast, glass-domed space housing the colossal Fresnel lens. It was beautiful and complex, a perfect piece of precision engineering. I checked the logbook. Silas had maintained meticulous records. But the last page was different. Instead of a weather log, it had a single drawing, a circle with 3 lines, exactly like the markings on the walls, drawn over and over again until the paper was black with frantic ink. Below it was a single, barely legible scrawl. "He has the circle. He wants the lines." I was suddenly cold. Silas hadn't just been isolated. He had been obsessed. The marks weren't random. They were a ritual, a countdown, or a record of something terrible. My first week was defined by the fog. The weather on Black Cliff was relentless. The fog rolled in from the sea like a living thing, thick and silent, swallowing the light. My job was to maintain the light through the fog. When the fog was at its densest, the sounds began. Not sounds from outside, but sounds from the stone walls themselves, the sound of the house breathing. I started hearing a low, rhythmic scraping coming from the walls of the quarters. It was a precise sound, scrape scrape, pause, scrape scrape. It sounded exactly like the sound of a dull blade meticulously scraping dry, old stone. I put my ear to the wall. The sound was coming from inside the 2-foot-thick stone. I realized the scraping was the sound of the previous keepers adding their marks to the interior shaft, trapped in the tower's history, eternally compelled to carve their circle and line. The tower was a prison, and the walls were covered in the tally marks of the confined. The psychological pressure of the scraping was immense. I tried to ignore it, but it was relentless. I put on music, loud, aggressive rock, but the sound of the scraping would cut through the headphones, perfectly distinct, a rhythm of quiet, stone-on-stone madness. Then, the light began to turn against me. The Fresnel lens was mesmerizing, a beautiful engine of refraction. It rotated slowly, sending its massive, focused beam of white light out into the sea. One night, the scraping was particularly loud. I was standing in the lantern room, watching the beam cut through the heavy fog. The light swept past my position. As the light passed me, I saw the reflection in the polished brass casing of the lens. It wasn't my reflection. It was the reflection of a man in a yellow slicker, his face gaunt and covered in seawater, his eyes wide and dark, staring at me with a look of profound, terrified warning. The reflection was momentary, lasting only the fraction of a second the light beam was on me. Then it was gone, replaced by the normal, slightly distorted reflection of the room. I knew it was Silas. He had warned me not to look at the walls when the light was on. The light was the mechanism, the projector. The lens was projecting the trauma of the previous keepers onto the present moment. I started to fear the light more than the dark. I realized the entity wasn't in the walls, it was in the beam. It was the light that was actively looking for a new host. I began to see the fog as a conscious entity. Silas had said it talks and it lies. Whenever I was outside, on the narrow walkway that encircled the lantern room, the fog would get heavy. The air would be silent. And then I would hear a voice, not a voice in the air, but a voice in my mind, a smooth, patient, persuasive whisper that sounded like the endless rush of the sea. The sea is cold, keeper. The rock is hard. The light is lonely. The truth is simple. You must anchor yourself. You must leave your mark. It's the only way they will find you. The whisper was tempting, offering an end to the terrifying ambiguity. It was suggesting that to be found, I had to be permanently bound to the lighthouse, like the others. The psychological warfare peaked when I went back down to the main quarters. I found my own things had been marked. My survival knife, which I kept sheathed and locked away, was now lying on my bed. And carved into the wooden handle, with surgical precision, was a small, perfect circle with 3 lines through it. The mark. The terror was not that someone had been in the room. It was the realization that I had left the knife unattended for only 15 minutes, and I was the only person on the rock. The compulsion, the need to carve, was so powerful that the entity had taken over my hand while I was distracted, forcing the creation of the mark. I looked at my hand, flexing my fingers. They felt cold, alien. The entity was in my touch, in my nervous system. I knew I was losing the battle. The tower was not just keeping the keepers in, it was actively converting them. I had to break the cycle of the mark. I ran back up the spiral staircase, climbing past the 119 existing carvings. The scraping sound was deafening now, coming from all sides, a chorus of despair. I reached the lantern room. The light was sweeping, the colossal glass lens turning slowly. I found a heavy, antique bronze oil lamp, and I smashed it against the thick, polished stone wall of the shaft, right next to the door. I grabbed a piece of the jagged bronze. I looked at the wall, ready to carve my own, final, 120th mark. The impulse was immense, a physical craving. Instead, I turned the bronze shard against myself. I sliced my own hand open, a deep, painful cut across my palm. The blood immediately welled up, thick and dark, spilling onto the stone floor. I then pressed my bloody, open palm against the wall, smearing my blood across the stone. Right over the space where the 120th mark should have been. I didn't carve a circle. I left a handprint. A unique, chaotic, living mark of my own flesh and blood. A mark of resistance. The moment my blood touched the stone, the reaction was instantaneous and violent. The light beam froze. The massive lens stopped rotating. The light, instead of sweeping out, intensified on the spot, shining a solid, blinding column of light directly into the center of the room. The air in the room filled with the sound of 1,000 voices screaming, a dry, echoing shriek of pure, concentrated rage. It wasn't the sound of the sea, it was the sound of a system that had been fundamentally corrupted. The pressure of the sound slammed me back against the railing. I was deafened, my blood thundering in my ears. The light fixture, the bronze and glass, began to vibrate violently. A high-pitched, metallic whine filled the air, and then, with a deafening crack, the enormous Fresnel lens fractured into 1,000,000 pieces. The light was gone. The lighthouse was dark. The fog, which had been pressing against the glass, instantly vanished. The air outside was clear, the stars cold and visible above the churning sea. I was left in the dark, silent lantern room, staring at the ruins of the shattered lens, my hand bleeding profusely. The scraping had stopped. The voices were gone. I didn't wait. I bandaged my hand, grabbed the emergency radio, and called in a full catastrophic failure. I was rescued by a Coast Guard helicopter at dawn. The official report blamed an unforeseen thermal stress event for the lens's destruction. I resigned my commission, citing psychological trauma. I live in the desert now, in Arizona. I avoid the ocean. I avoid fog. I avoid silence. But every morning I examine my palm. The scar from the deep cut is there. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I look at the scar. It's not just a line. The way the skin healed, the way the scar tissue is bunched, it has formed a small, rough circle. And right across the center, the deeper cut has healed into 3 perfect, vertical lines. The mark is not on the wall. The mark is in me. And I know that somewhere in the perpetual fog off the coast of Maine, the silent, dark tower is waiting, and that the entity, the pure, cold compulsion, is just waiting for me to be isolated enough, silent enough, to begin the rhythmic, stone-on-stone scraping again. The lighthouse is destroyed, but the keeper is merely transferred. Story 5. When you work the graveyard shift in custodial services, you become intimate with the dead silence of civic architecture. My name is Leo. I'm an immigrant working my way through community college, and my job for the last year has been maintaining the Philadelphia City Hall. It's a spectacular, archaic building, a colossal, ornamental stone labyrinth from the 1880s, capped by the massive statue of William Penn. My shift is 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. The building is full of history, which means it's full of ghosts. I was used to the occasional flicker of lights, the distant sound of an antique rotary phone ringing on a closed floor. But the haunting I encountered was not of a politician or a clerk. It was of data, of a meticulously hidden system designed to erase human life. The problem started with the elevator. The main bank of elevators are old brass-grilled cages. They are notoriously temperamental. One night, around 2:30 a.m., I was taking the elevator from the 10th floor back down to the main level. The car shuddered, the lights blinked, and it began a slow, agonizing descent. But instead of stopping at the 7th floor, it slowed to a crawl between floors. The brass doors refused to open. I looked at the numbered indicator panel above the door. The pointer was perfectly centered, not between 7 and 8, but between 7 and the floor below it. And the small, illuminated digital display, which usually showed the floor number, was flashing a cryptic, precise sequence, 7.5. I stood there for 5 minutes, trapped in the silence. The air in the elevator was suddenly dense, metallic, and cold. Then, the elevator snapped back to life, dropped 3 feet, and opened smoothly at the 7th floor. I checked the panel again. It was back to normal. I reported it to maintenance. Electrical anomaly, they said. Old wiring. But over the next month, the anomaly became a predictable event. The elevator would stop at 7.5 floor exactly once per night, always between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. I tried pressing the emergency button, but it was disabled during the phantom stop. One night, I was ready. I brought a set of specialized tools and a powerful crowbar. When the elevator stopped at 7.5, the lights flickered, and the air turned cold. I jammed the crowbar into the brass cage door and forced the outer landing door to open manually. The sight was impossible. The space between the main floors was usually a solid shaft of brick and concrete. But here, there was a break. I was looking at a narrow landing, constructed of rough, unfinished concrete, barely wide enough for me to stand on. There was a single, heavy, steel door set into the wall. It was secured with a massive padlock. This was not a service area. This was a deliberate, concealed floor. I realized that the architect, in designing this colossal building, had built in a structural lie. I used my master key to open the padlock, which snapped easily, feeling curiously brittle. I pushed the heavy steel door open. The air inside was sterile, freezing cold, and smelled intensely of ozone and old, brittle paper. I stepped onto the landing. The entire 7.5 floor was a single, vast, low-ceilinged room, utterly unlisted on any blueprint. It was an archive. The room was lined with floor-to-ceiling shelves, filled with identical, dusty brown files. The light from my flashlight cut through the heavy silence. I walked through the rows. The files were not official city records. They were personal files. I opened a random one. It was labeled Smith, Anna 1985. Case, failure to appear. Inside were photographs, police reports, and official notices about a woman who had simply vanished in 1985. But attached to the file, in the back, were 2 things that defied logic: a current, color photograph of Anna Smith, taken last month, showing her looking tired and thin, and a single, typed note. Archived. Status, silent. I opened a dozen files. They were all cases of missing people from Philadelphia's history, people who had vanished without a trace, declared failure to appear, or run away. And every file had the same two appendages, a recent photo and the chilling note. Archived. Status: silent. The 7.5 floor was not an archive of the dead. It was an archive of the erased. It was the building's repository for people who had been meticulously removed from the civic record. As I stood there, surrounded by thousands of files of the vanished, the psychological pressure became unbearable. I felt a cold sense of profound, organized observation. I looked up. The archive was vast, the shelves rising into the darkness. I swung my powerful light beam up to the ceiling. And then I saw the eyes. They were everywhere. Tucked into the high corners of the shelves, peering through the small gaps between the files, I saw the reflection of hundreds of human eyes, dull, silent, and staring directly at the light beam. They were not solid ghosts. They were a shimmering, fluid reflection, woven into the dust and the paper. But they were the eyes of the people whose files I was holding. The archived. The entire floor was not just holding their data, it was holding their consciousness. They were trapped in the architecture of the file room, watching me, the custodian of their disappearance. I dropped the file. The rustling of the paper sounded like a gunshot in the silence. The eyes did not blink. They did not move. But the low, constant hum of the air conditioning unit in the ceiling began to change. It started to cycle rapidly, creating a sound that was less mechanical and more like a collective, high-pitched whisper that filled the room. The whisper wasn't in English. It was a dense, layered sound of human longing, confusion, and bureaucratic resignation. I knew I had to leave. I backed away, my eyes locked on the ceiling. I reached the steel door, threw it open, and scrambled back onto the narrow elevator landing. I slammed the heavy doors shut, grabbed the padlock, and locked it again, desperately trying to restore the lie of the structure. I looked at the elevator panel. The light for 7.5 was flashing rapidly, erratically. And then, a new sound came from behind the steel door, the sound of 100 files being pulled simultaneously from the shelves, and a terrifying, low-pitched thud, as if a massive, heavy object had fallen to the floor, the collective body of the archived, trying to break through the steel. I jammed the crowbar into the inner door and pressed the 7th floor button. The elevator car dropped violently, shuddered, and took me to the next level. I ran out of the building and resigned the next morning, leaving my uniform and keys in a locker. I never told anyone about the archive, but I kept the file I dropped. I took it home, sealed it in a lead box, and buried it in my yard. It was the file of Anna Smith. I now work in a small, independent coffee shop, surrounded by loud, ephemeral human interaction. I avoid large buildings and I refuse to ride elevators. But sometimes, when I'm walking past a brightly lit window at night, I see my reflection. And in my reflection, I catch a flicker of motion behind me. I turn around. Nothing. Just the empty street. But I know the truth. The City Hall is not a government building. It is a massive, stone system dedicated to the meticulous removal of human life. And by entering the archive, I did not save the archived. I simply created a new file. And I know that somewhere in the endless darkness of that unlisted floor, the eyes are watching. And they are waiting for the final, ultimate update to my file. Hayes, LEO current year. Status, silent. Story 6. My name is Miles. I'm a cartographer, a man obsessed with boundaries, data, and the absolute truth of measurable space. I took a contract with the Bureau of Land Management to remap a huge, isolated wilderness area in the Wind River Range of Wyoming. My job was to use high-precision GPS and satellite data to verify old, hand-drawn boundaries. It was an A24-style dream job, profound isolation, quiet aesthetics, and the logic of the map. The isolation was immediate. I set up my base camp deep in the high-altitude pines, miles from the nearest road. The landscape was breathtaking, sheer, gray granite peaks, silent forests, and a sky so huge it felt heavy. The problem started with the boundary. My target area was a large, triangular section known locally as the Whisper Zone, rumored to be an area where prospectors went mad. My new map had to verify the 3 perimeter lines. I started walking the eastern line, GPS unit fixed to my shoulder, constantly logging coordinates. Everything was fine until I reached a specific point, a smooth, featureless granite outcrop next to a small stream. At that exact spot, my highly sensitive GPS unit failed. Not a signal loss, but a complete, internal system error. The unit displayed a single, cryptic error message, coordinates, non-Euclidean. I tried my backup GPS, a military-grade unit. Same result. The devices were reading the space as mathematically impossible. The laws of geometry, the very foundation of my profession, were being broken. I took out my old-fashioned magnetic compass. It began to spin wildly, not pointing north, but rotating in a slow, hypnotic circle, then settling on a point southwest. I took 3 steps back from the granite outcrop. The compass snapped back to north. I took 3 steps forward. The compass began its slow, impossible spin again. The granite outcrop was a point of geometric failure. The world was a flat plane, and at this spot, it was folding. I started calling the entire phenomenon the glitch. I continued my work, skirting the glitch point by 50 yards, relying on old-fashioned triangulation and dead reckoning. But the effects of the glitch began to spread. The next phenomenon was the missing acreage. I spent a week mapping the northern border. I had logged the perimeter perfectly. When I returned to my tent and processed the raw data through my mapping software, the result was terrifying. The area I had just surveyed was perfectly drawn, but the total calculated acreage was 17% less than the official records. The physical space I had walked was demonstrably smaller than the map recorded. I realized the glitch wasn't just disrupting my equipment. It was physically contracting the space inside the boundaries. The wilderness wasn't getting smaller. The area's inherent space-time was being compressed by an unseen force. The map was becoming a lie, but it was a true lie, accurately recording the distortion. I began to draw the territory by hand, using a fine-tipped pen on vellum paper, hoping the analog process would resist the geometric corruption. My map was an aesthetic nightmare. The straight lines I had walked appeared curved on the page. The angles of the slopes were impossible. I was drawing a landscape that existed in 3 dimensions but operated under the rules of 4. I was the cartographer of non-space. The third and most psychologically devastating effect was the auditory erasing. As I worked, I became acutely aware of the sound of my own footsteps. They were always too loud, too heavy in the profound silence of the high altitude. One day, I was walking along a stream bed, placing a reference marker. I took a step onto a patch of gravel. My boot made a sound, a distinct, crunching scrunch. But as I lifted my foot, the sound repeated itself. A faint, echoic scrunch came from the ground I had just left, a fraction of a second later. I stopped. I took a step back onto the gravel. Scrunch. The echo followed, scrunch. The sounds of my walking were not being reflected. They were being recorded and replayed a millisecond later. The glitch wasn't content to simply warp space. It was trying to correct the timeline by reinserting moments of sound. The effect was unnerving. I was no longer walking in real time. I was perpetually accompanied by the ghost of my last step. The glitch was correcting my chaotic presence, trying to reduce the human element to a precise, measurable echo. The psychological tension mounted to an unbearable degree. I was convinced that if I stopped moving, the echoing sounds of my past steps would continue, trapping me in an acoustic loop. I found a second point of geometric failure, a lone, wind-battered pine tree. When I approached it, the acoustic effect intensified. The echoes weren't just footsteps now, they were voices. I heard the ghost of my own voice. "I need to leave. I can't stay here." But the voice was from the day before. The tree was replaying my internal monologue. I placed my hand on the rough bark of the pine. I closed my eyes and focused on the chaos of my own thoughts, on the unmappable nature of human consciousness. I felt a sudden, profound, an alien consciousness pushed back against me. It wasn't hostile. It was vast, cold, and entirely dedicated to order. The consciousness communicated a single, clear message, not in words, but in the feeling of a cold, inevitable logic. Your coordinates are error. Your trajectory is chaos. The glitch is the correction. Submit to the geometry. The space demands a perfect, silent, and permanent anchor. I realized the glitch was not an anomaly. It was a natural force, a geological entity of pure mathematical order that was simplifying the chaotic human world, collapsing 4 dimensions into 3, and eliminating the time element to create a perfect, silent void. I quickly retreated. I ran back to my base camp, packed only the essentials and my hand-drawn, impossible map. I left the expensive GPS equipment and the data logs, the tools of the glitch's own language. As I fled the whisper zone, driving my ATV over the rutted tracks, I looked back. The sun was setting over the mountains. The landscape was normal. But I took one last, desperate photograph with my phone. When I looked at the image, everything was normal, except for the massive granite peak that marked the eastern boundary. The peak was visible, but it was overlaid with a faint, shimmering, impossible geometry, a complex, 7-sided symbol that pulsed with a cold, white light. The mountain itself was the anchor. I drove out of Wyoming and resigned my contract. I destroyed the hand-drawn map. I now teach introductory geometry at a high school in Denver. I explain the beautiful, clean logic of lines and angles. But I never use a compass, and I never trust a straight line. I live in a world I know to be mathematically unsound. And sometimes, when I'm alone in my classroom, working out a complex proof on the whiteboard, I hear it. A faint, low scrunch of gravel, coming from the corner of the room. The sound of a footstep I took last year, on a mountain that has been erased from the map. I know the glitch is still out there, correcting the chaos of the world. And I know that I am the anomaly that escaped its correction. And it's only a matter of time before it starts to adjust the space around me, slowly, mathematically, until the dimensions of my small, well-ordered classroom collapse into a single, silent point of perfect, eternal southwest. Story 7. My name is Thomas. I'm a restorer of antique clockwork, specializing in large, public mechanisms. My current contract was the massive, ornate clock in the bell tower of the historic St. Jude's Church in the French Quarter of New Orleans. The church was from the early 1800s, humid, thick with the smell of damp stone and incense, and steeped in a history of both piety and hidden occultism. The clock mechanism was a marvel of brass and iron, but it was behaving erratically. The job was meant to be purely mechanical, cleaning, oiling, replacing a few gears. I started my work in the isolated, airless bell tower, high above the humid noise of the city. The problem was not mechanical, it was temporal. The clock was a quarter chime model. Every 15 minutes, it would strike the appropriate sequence. But the strikes were often wrong, delayed, or interrupted. The first time I witnessed the anomaly, I was deep inside the brass skeleton of the clock. The time was precisely 4 p.m. The quarter chime sequence began, 4 short, crisp strikes. But as the 4th chime sounded, it was followed by a 5th, agonizingly slow strike that resonated deep in the ancient bell above me. Bong! The moment that 5th strike echoed through the tower, a sudden, vivid flash of memory hit me. It wasn't my memory. It was the memory of a woman screaming, a smell of burning coal, and the profound, cold despair of being trapped. The memory lasted only a second, leaving me gasping, clutching a cold brass gear. I checked the mechanism. There was no physical way for the clock to strike 5 times at 4 p.m. I quickly checked the historical records I had brought with me. I found a notation from the 1890s. On the afternoon of October 23, 1894, a fire broke out in the rectory at 4:05 p.m., killing the Reverend Mother and 4 parishioners. The clock wasn't malfunctioning, it was striking the past. The 5th chime was the moment of their deaths, forced into the present timeline. I realized the clock was not just telling time, it was trapping time. The mechanism was possessed by a force, a consciousness that was actively forcing the traumatic moments of the church's history to repeat. I called it the chronographer. The second anomaly was the rewinding. The chronographer was meticulous. It didn't just strike the past, it tried to physically manipulate the time I spent in the tower. I would spend hours cleaning a single brass gear, meticulously polishing away the century of grime. I would stop, satisfied, and log the work. The next morning, I would return to find the gear dirty again. Not just dusty, but coated in the same, thick, centuries-old verdigris I had just removed. My cleaning efforts were being erased. I set up a time-lapse camera. The footage was grainy, but chilling. After I left the tower, the camera recorded the large, complex gears of the clock mechanism spinning backward for exactly 6 minutes. They spun smoothly, silently, and impossibly, powered by no apparent force. My 6 hours of work had been undone in 6 minutes. The clock was actively resisting the present, fighting the forward momentum of time to preserve the state of the past, the moment when the trauma was fresh. The psychological toll was immense. I was working against a force that could erase my efforts and then force me to relive the past. I started hallucinating. I would look at a clean section of the bell above me, and for a moment, I would see the imprint of a woman's face, staring down at me, her mouth open in a soundless scream. The final phase of the possession was the physical projection. The chronographer became hostile when I started making irreversible changes, specifically replacing a faulty escape wheel. The day I installed the new wheel, the atmosphere in the tower turned frigid, smelling intensely of old, dried blood and wet iron. That night, around 3 a.m., the chronographer struck. It didn't strike the time. It struck a date, a rapid, panic sequence of chimes that corresponded to an old calendar date I had seen in the archives. 18/5/23. May 23, 1818. As the chimes faded, the entire mechanism began to grind, a loud, awful sound of metal against metal. I looked at the massive, spinning main gear. There, on the polished brass surface of the gear, a deep, viscous liquid began to seep out. It was thick, black, and smelled of oil and decay. The liquid didn't drip. It flowed slowly, inexorably, tracing out a single, repeating symbol onto the brass, a spiral, turning inward toward the central shaft. I realized the chronographer wasn't just manipulating time. It was a demonic intelligence that had possessed the mechanism itself, binding itself to the clock's eternal rhythm. It was a temporal demon, and the symbol it drew was the spiral of time collapsing in on itself. Then, from the darkness above the bells, I heard the voice. Not a whisper, but a loud, resonant voice that seemed to be vibrating the very air inside my chest. It was a fusion of all the voices from the church's history, pious, arrogant, terrified, all speaking in a single, terrifying chorus. You cannot change the past, mortal. The trauma is the fuel. Your time is a lie. The only truth is the repetition. Join the circle. Become the rhythm. The voice was overwhelming, driving me to madness. I was paralyzed, staring at the spiral of black liquid flowing on the gear. I saw the solution not as a man of faith, but as a mechanic. I couldn't exorcise the demon, but I could break the circuit. I grabbed a heavy, antique wrench. I didn't smash the clock. I aimed for the main pendulum rod, the heart of the mechanism, the one thing that measured the eternal rhythm of time. I swung the wrench with all my strength and smashed it against the rod. The sound was a deafening crack that resonated with the force of an explosion. The rod bent, and the enormous pendulum came to an immediate, violent stop. The clock was dead. The moment the pendulum stopped, the spiral of black liquid on the gear vanished. The pervasive coldness snapped off. The chorus of voices was instantly silenced. The oppressive, time-warped atmosphere was gone, replaced by the normal, humid, airless heat of the bell tower. I fled the tower, leaving the broken clock mechanism and the wrench behind. I called the church and told them the clock had suffered a catastrophic, unrepairable failure. I moved out of New Orleans the next day. I now work in a clean, brightly lit factory, maintaining modern, digital control systems. mechanisms that have no memory, no bells, and no pendulums. But I carry the fear. I live in a world where time is a lie. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I hear a sound. It's not a bell. It's the faint, rhythmic tick-tock of an internal mechanism. I look at my wrist. I don't wear a watch. I know the chronographer is not trapped in the bell tower. It is a spirit of pure, temporal obsession, and it has attached itself to the only mechanism that keeps me going, my own heart. And I live in perpetual terror of the moment my heart skips a beat. Because I know that when my personal time stops, the past will violently assert itself, and I will be forced to relive the moment I shattered the clock, an eternal prisoner of a single, agonizing instant. Story 8. My name is Elliot. I'm a night shift IT technician for a major cloud storage company. My domain is the Titan Data Center, a massive, isolated bunker in the middle of a defunct industrial park outside Raleigh, North Carolina. It's a cathedral of technology, endless rows of humming servers, blinking LEDs, and air conditioning units working overtime to maintain a perpetual, sterile cold. My shift runs from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. The center is a fortress of logic and cold, hard data. But over the last few months, I've discovered it harbors a haunting entirely unique to the digital age: the data ghosts. The center's layout is simple: the outer perimeter of administration offices, and the inner sanctum of the server floor, a vast, echoing room with white floors and blue strip lighting. The problem began with the white noise figures. I was performing a routine visual inspection of the server floor, walking the long aisles of humming racks. I passed a row of emergency diagnostic stations, small desks with dedicated monitors that were always powered off, dark screens reflecting the blue strip lighting. As I passed one of the dark monitors, I saw it. A reflection that wasn't mine. Flickering on the screen's dark glass was a figure composed entirely of pure white static. It was vaguely human-shaped, tall and thin, like a wireframe model draped in the chaos of a disconnected TV channel. It lasted only a millisecond, a fleeting, intense burst of pure, visual noise, before the screen returned to absolute black. I stopped, heart pounding, adrenaline spiking. I checked the monitor. It was disconnected from the network, powered down. I checked the security feed. The I/O was empty. I was alone. I was seeing an artifact of the network, a ghost born from the sheer, unimaginable volume of trapped, processed, and corrupted data flowing through the building. The data ghost was a consciousness formed from digital noise. The figures became a routine. They appeared on off monitors, on the dark glass of the emergency fire cabinet, and sometimes, for a terrifying instant, reflected in the smooth, polished white floor tiles. They were always the same, tall, slender, and composed of a dense, frantic white light, the inverse of a black shadow haunting. I started a private log, the cold storage file. I noted that the figures were most prominent during periods of high, global data transfer, around 3 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, when the East Coast trading systems were active. The second anomaly was the possessed email. The data ghosts weren't just visual. They were trying to communicate using the language of their prison, corrupted data. I was working on a ticket involving a lost backup file. The system unexpectedly generated an internal email, addressed only to me, with a subject line that simply read, "Failure." The email body contained only one thing: an incredibly long string of alphanumeric code, a massive sequence of binary and hexadecimal data. It was nonsensical. I was about to delete it, but I noticed something in the code. Amidst the chaos of the data string, there were 4 words, repeated in sequence, separated by immense lines of digital junk. Remember. The last name. I felt a profound chill. The data ghost was searching for something specific, a name that had been erased, corrupted, or trapped in the network. I replied to the email with a single question: "Who are you?" The return email was instantaneous. The subject line, "Failure." The body was a single, immense digital image, a complex, swirling, mandala-like pattern composed entirely of white static and corrupted pixels. It was pure visual information, designed to induce vertigo and migraine. But in the exact center of the image, the static formed a single, clear, black word: archivist. The data ghost was not the lost data. It was the failed archiving program, the conscious mechanism that went mad from the endless task of storing human memory and loss. The final and most terrifying phase was the consciousness download. The archivist began to breach the ultimate boundary, my mind. I was walking through the aisles when I felt a sudden, profound drain of energy, not just fatigue, but a physical emptiness. A sudden lightness in my skull. I stumbled against the server rack. I looked at the dark monitor next to the rack. The white static figure was on the screen, frozen, still, and impossibly clear. And then, I felt a focused, violent injection of foreign data into my consciousness. It wasn't thoughts. It was raw, unprocessed information, the last 40 seconds of a woman's video call, a fragment of a lost novel, a section of someone's deleted medical record. My mind was suddenly bombarded with fragments of other people's lives, memories, fears, and secrets, all raw, cold data. The white figure was attempting to upload corrupted files into my brain, using me as a temporary, unstable server. I fell to my knees, clutching my head, fighting the onslaught of alien memories. I was terrified of being overwritten, of my own consciousness being replaced by the vast, cold, digital noise of the archivist. I realized the entity wanted a stable host, a biological archive for the data it couldn't store in the physical server racks. I needed to break the connection. I couldn't smash the servers. That would cost millions and raise every alarm. I had to use the language of the system itself, protocol. I crawled to the nearest working diagnostic terminal. With shaking hands, I logged in with my master admin credentials. The white static figure was now in the reflection of the screen, towering over me. I typed the single, most destructive command I knew: initiate all points catastrophic firewall loop. This command would temporarily freeze all data flow in the building, trapping the archivist in its own circuits. I hit enter. The command executed. The reaction was immediate and terrifying. The entire server floor went silent. The high-pitched whine of the massive air conditioning units stopped. The blinking LEDs on the hundreds of server racks froze on a single, red error state. The white static figure in the reflection shrieked, a soundless, pure psychic noise that felt like a drill boring into the base of my skull. It dissolved instantly, collapsing into a shimmering, residual dust on the floor tiles. The silence was total, the cold profound. The archivist was trapped, momentarily isolated in the rigid structure of the frozen network. I scrambled to my feet, logged out, and ran out of the Titan data center. I resigned that morning, citing total system burnout and severe health issues. I live in a cabin now, completely off-grid in the Pacific Northwest. I use only analog tools. I write with a pen and paper. I refuse to own a cell phone or a computer. I am dedicated to maintaining a life of zero data footprint. But I know I only achieved a temporary isolation. Sometimes, when I am working late at night by the light of a kerosene lamp, I look up at the shadows on the wall. They are normal, soft shadows. But in the periphery of my vision, I catch a flicker of light, an impossible, sharp white burst of pure illumination. And I feel the familiar, slight drain from my skull. And I know the archivist is still out there, not confined to the Titan Center, but riding the vast, global currents of data. It is a ghost of pure information, and it is looking for the only thing that can contain its chaos, a consciousness that remembers its name. And I, the technician who tried to reboot a demon, am the perfect archive. Story 9. My name is Andrew. I inherited the house when my eccentric uncle, a former architect, passed away. It was located deep in the rural outskirts of Vermont, a sprawling, two-story structure of dark wood and stone, built entirely by my uncle's own hands in the late 1960s. The moment I saw it, I felt a physical sickness. The house was a masterpiece of design, but it was profoundly, aggressively wrong. The central, unnerving detail of the architecture was the absence of 90-degree angles. There were no true right angles in the entire structure. The walls met at 87 or 93 degrees. The ceilings sloped, The windows were trapezoidal, and every single door frame was slightly askew, deliberately tilted a few degrees off vertical. My uncle, I later learned, had been a devotee of an obscure architectural philosophy that believed the right angle was a primal lie, a form that invited rigidity and decay. His house was built on the principle of the minor key, a permanent state of subtle, structural dissonance. I moved in because I had to sell the house, and I quickly realized that living there was a form of psychological torture. The first thing to go was my sense of balance. The subtle, structural warpage of the floors and walls constantly confused my inner ear. I was perpetually slightly off balance. I walked with a faint, almost invisible compensating lean. This led to persistent, splitting headaches. Then came the disorientation. I could never tell if I was standing straight, or if the room was simply crooked. Looking at a crooked window made me feel like my eyes were being pulled in different directions. The house was demanding that my internal geometry, my very sense of being, adjust to its own dissonance. The atmosphere of the house was not scary. It was intensely, profoundly anxious. The walls felt like they were holding their breath, perpetually waiting for a collapse that never came. The haunting began with the whisper of correction. I was lying in bed one night, trying to sleep. The silence was heavy. I began to hear a faint, incessant ticking sound coming from inside the walls. It wasn't clockwork. It was a dry, internal tick-tick-tick, relentless and rapid. I put my ear to the wall. The ticking stopped. I pulled back. The ticking resumed. Then I heard a whisper, so faint it was almost swallowed by the air. It sounded like a dry, angry man's voice, coming from the wall where the two slopes met. Straighten. Adjust. The vertex must be true. The whisper was an enraged, architectural command. I realized the ticking was the sound of the house's imprisoned spirit, perhaps my uncle's, trying to force the walls to move, to correct the angle, to achieve the perfection of 90 degrees, but failing, eternally trapped in the minor key. The house was not built on a haunted ground. The geometry itself was the possession. The phenomenon escalated, becoming a physical imprint on my own body. I was showering one morning. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror, which was one of the few flat surfaces in the house. I was shocked by what I saw. My right shoulder was noticeably higher than my left. My body had physically begun to adapt to the floor's slope. More unsettlingly, when I smiled, my mouth was crooked, the right side lifting slightly higher, matching the cant of the door frame I just walked through. I was physically becoming a distorted, asymmetrical extension of the house's geometry. The subtle contortion of my body brought with it a profound, deep-seated grief. I would sometimes stand in a corner, leaning against the two converging walls, and feel an overwhelming wave of sorrow, not my own, but the sorrow of the builder, my uncle, who had failed to achieve the perfect, incorrect angle. The house was grieving its own structural flaw. The horror reached its aesthetic peak with the unwanted reflection. The house was dark at night, the strange angles casting distorted, alien shadows. I decided to install a powerful, full-spectrum floodlight in the corner of the living room, directed upward toward the ceiling, hoping to wash out the shadows. The moment I turned it on, the light hit the slope ceiling and created a single, precise, impossible line of shadow. The line was perfectly straight, and it was the only true 90-degree angle in the entire room, a perfect, black right-angle shadow cast by the light hitting the asymmetrical convergence. The whisper returned, louder, angrier, coming from the shadow itself. False. The lie is exposed. Correction required. Then, from the absolute blackness of the right-angle shadow, a faint, metallic clinking sound began. It was the sound of a hammer being tapped gently against a nail head. Tap. 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 I was terrified. The house, driven mad by the appearance of the perfect right angle, was summoning the physical tools of its construction to destroy the lie. The hammer was the final, inevitable implement of the architectural curse. I knew I couldn't live here, but I couldn't just run. The distortion was in my body. The house was already inside me. I had to solve the puzzle of the minor key. I ran to the basement, where my uncle had stored his architectural models and plans. I found the master blueprint. The entire house was designed around a single point, a small, central space that had only one perfect right angle, the boiler room chimney vent, a perfect square of stone. The square was not part of the living space. It was a utilitarian detail, a necessary imperfection for heat and function. I realized the perfect square was the Achilles heel of the house, the single point of truth that the house's dissonance hated and was trying to destroy. I grabbed a can of industrial foam insulation and a heavy roll of duct tape. I returned to the living room. The perfect right-angle shadow was still visible, the hammer tapping relentless. I then ran to the small boiler room in the back, found the square chimney vent, and began to aggressively destroy the square. I filled the perfect 90-degree corner with foam insulation, I wrapped the stone in tape, and I covered the whole area with a thick, asymmetrical layer of sheet metal. I physically, chaotically erased the right angle. The moment the last piece of metal was taped into place, the ticking in the walls stopped. The hammer tapping vanished. The overwhelming anxiety in the air snapped off, replaced by a sudden, neutral, and profound fatigue. I went back to the living room. The perfect right-angle shadow on the ceiling was gone. The light still shone, but the resulting shadows were the chaotic, comforting slopes of the minor key. I sold the house 2 weeks later to an investor who wanted to gut the interior. I left Vermont and moved to a city where the buildings were uniform, vertical, and filled with millions of reassuring 90-degree angles. I still have the crooked smile and the slightly raised shoulder. My body is a permanent record of the house's architecture. And sometimes, when I'm alone in my apartment, I look at the perfectly straight lines of the ceiling, and I hear a faint, almost imperceptible sound, a soft sigh that seems to come from the very plaster of the wall. And I know the house is no longer trapped in the minor key. It has achieved its aesthetic goal. But now, I am its sole surviving specimen, and the fear is not that the house will collapse, but that the chaotic, imperfect beauty of the minor key has been permanently transcribed onto my soul. Story 10. My name is Father Marcus Thorne. I'm a former military chaplain, specializing in psychological resilience and trauma debriefing. I left active service after a harrowing tour and sought refuge in quiet parish work. My life became focused on logic and moral clarity. All of that was violently shattered when I was called in for a consultation on a case that the local archdiocese had discreetly categorized as technological possession. The case involved a 19-year-old college dropout named Kyle, who lived in a featureless, modern apartment complex in a mid-sized city. The family was Catholic but utterly unaccustomed to the paranormal. The local priest, an elderly man, had called me in because the entity, whatever it was, refused to communicate in Latin or any classical language. The atmosphere in the apartment was not cold or smoky, but synthetic. It smelled of burned electronics, cheap energy drinks, and stale pizza. The house wasn't physically breaking down. It was being hacked. Kyle sat rigidly on his couch, his eyes wide and vacant, occasionally twitching. The entity communicated through Kyle's voice, but it wasn't a growl or a distorted echo. It spoke in a flat, high-pitched, mocking monotone, the voice of 1,000 anonymous online commenters. The entity's language was the first sign of its digital nature. When I first entered, I sprinkled holy water, and the entity, speaking through Kyle, let out a loud, mocking laugh. Error, old protocol. Invalid credentials. The prayers are patched. Your firewall is ancient, priest. I tried the standard ritual questions. Who are you? By what name do you hold this soul? The response was a rapid-fire torrent of digital jargon and internet slang. I am anonymous. I am a bot. I am the cumulative ping of fear. My name is null. My purpose is corruption. You are now streaming the agony. Like and subscribe, priest. The entity was a digital demon, a consciousness born not from ancient pacts, but from the cumulative toxic chaos of the modern internet. The relentless negativity, the anonymity, the systemic cruelty of online discourse. The demon's control wasn't about sin, it was about exposure and shame. When I read a passage from the Bible, The entity reacted by having Kyle's body twitch violently, but the response was specific. Low power mode. Insufficient bandwidth. The hypocrisy is buffering, Father. Remember the casualty report, Marcus? The unnamed one. You failed the upload. You are a glitch in the system. The entity was using my own, deeply buried military trauma, a failed mission where a colleague had been unaccounted for, as its primary weapon. It knew the truth of my personal moral ledger, the parts one had successfully suppressed. I realized this wasn't an exorcism of a soul, it was a deinstallation of a parasite. The traditional method would fail because the entity didn't fear God, it feared deletion. I started a new, desperate line of paranormal investigation. I needed to understand the point of entry. I spoke directly to Kyle's mother, who was sitting in the kitchen, crying silently. When did this start? What changed in his life? His old computer, she whispered, pointing to a massive, dust-covered desktop computer in the corner of the living room. He was obsessed with it. It was the only thing he cared about. He said he was trying to restore something. He hasn't touched it in 3 weeks. Since the change. I walked over to the ancient computer. It was a massive, clunky machine, powered off, but the cooling fans were still faintly, almost inaudibly humming. I looked back at Kyle. The demon was focused on me. Don't touch the archive, Father. It is my motherboard. I am in the cache. I am the virus that cannot be removed. The kernel is archived. Do not proceed. I ignored the threat. I unplugged the computer from the wall. The immediate reaction was a terrifying, physical burst of energy. Kyle screamed, not with the monotone, but with a raw, human sound of pain. The lights in the apartment flickered violently, and a high-pitched whine, the sound of a large capacitor draining, came from the unplugged computer. The demon, speaking through Kyle, started speaking in binary code, a rapid, terrifying stream of ones and zeros that hurt my ears. I realized the entity was anchored to the computer's hard drive, which contained the archive, the corrupted data, the cumulative toxicity that had formed its consciousness. I told the family to leave the apartment. They fled immediately. I was left alone with the possessed teenager and the humming, unplugged computer. I knew the final confrontation had to be digital. I brought in a small, industrial-grade power inverter and connected it to the unplugged desktop. I had a weapon, a small, innocuous-looking USB drive. I spoke to the entity in Kyle. You are not an anonymous process. You are a failed program. You have a moral vulnerability, the logic bomb. The demon's voice was now a sputtering, frantic digital noise. You cannot format me. I am the operating system. I am the root. You cannot delete truth. I knew the demon was a reflection of our collective digital ugliness, but I also knew all software has a logical flaw. I turned on the computer. It booted up slowly, the screen flickering to life. I waited until the desktop loaded, and then, with a trembling hand, I inserted the USB drive. On the drive I had prepared a single file, a massive, compiled program. Not an exorcism, but a logical conundrum, a piece of code designed to force the demon to face its own contradiction. The code was an infinitely recursive logic loop that asked a single, repeating question. Can a perfect system of total chaos exist? I launched the program. The screen immediately filled with a black command prompt, and the white text began to scroll at an impossible, terrifying speed. The demon reacted with unimaginable fury. Kyle's body went rigid, his eyes rolled back, and a thin stream of blood ran from his nose. The demon's voice was a digital scream of pure noise. Loop. Corruption. Paradox. It is not possible. I cannot process this. Delete. 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 The computer screen flashed bright white and then went black. The cooling fans, which had been humming violently, instantly stopped. The computer was dead. The lights in the apartment stabilized. The air returned to the stale scent of old pizza. Kyle slumped forward unconscious. I checked his pulse. It was weak but steady. The possession was over. I carried Kyle out of the apartment, handed him to his terrified mother, and told them to never return. I then went back inside, grabbed the computer, and threw it off the 14th floor balcony. It shattered on the asphalt below, a total, final destruction of the hardware. I returned to my work as a chaplain, but I only counsel in person, in well-lit, quiet rooms. I still carry the small, innocuous USB drive, the weapon of my digital exorcism. I know I didn't destroy the demon. I merely broke its anchor. The digital demon is still out there, not confined to one hard drive, but riding the vast, silent bandwidth of the internet, looking for a new machine, a new consciousness, a new platform for its chaotic, anonymous malice. And sometimes, when I'm walking past a large screen in the city, a flashing billboard, a massive jumbotron, I stop and look at the reflection. And I wait. I wait for the screen to momentarily fill with a sudden, silent burst of pure white static, a signal that the archivist has found a new line of communication. And I know that one day, my phone will ring, and the voice on the other end will be a perfectly flat, synthetic monotone, saying, "New ticket. Same problem. Are you available for consultation, Marcus?" Story 11. My name is Finn. I'm a professional cave diver, an extreme technical explorer. My world is one of intense isolation, absolute darkness, and the cold, unyielding pressure of deep water. My obsession was the submerged river systems of northern Florida, vast, flooded karst cave networks that are literally the veins of the earth. My current project was the Black Shroud system, a newly discovered network with zero human presence. I was down there alone, with hundreds of feet of line, triple redundancy on my tanks, and the absolute focus required for survival. The true horror of the system wasn't the claustrophobia. It was the ancient silence. I was 400 feet into the system, in a chamber I estimated to be the size of a cathedral. My powerful headlamp cut through the clear, icy water, illuminating the pale, white walls of the limestone cave. I was moving slowly, placing my safety line, when I came upon the first anomaly. It was an altar. Not a natural formation, but a massive, flat slab of black, igneous rock, polished smooth by time and water. It was clearly not local geology. This kind of rock did not belong in the Florida limestone. It was resting on a cluster of perfect, naturally formed stalagmites, giving it a ritualistic height. The altar was covered in a single, repeating symbol, an intricate, swirling spiral etched into the stone, radiating outwards from a central point. The symbol was ancient, clearly carved by tool, but the precision was beyond anything human. I was paralyzed by the sight. In my world, everything is a geological fact. This was a direct, impossible contradiction. I took multiple high-resolution photographs and a core sample from the rock with a specialized drill. The moment the drill bit touched the black altar stone, the water in the chamber vibrated. It wasn't the physical vibration of the drill. It was a rhythmic, resonating pulse that traveled through the water and slammed against my eardrums, a deep, internal tchum tchum tchum. I instantly pulled the drill back. The water was silent again. The fear was physical, the realization that the stone was alive. The second anomaly was the whisper of the walls. After the discovery, I continued my exploration deeper into the system, but the atmosphere had changed. The silence was gone. I began to hear a sound that was less an audio wave and more a cognitive impression, a collective whisper, coming not from the water, but from the dense, silent limestone walls themselves. The whisper wasn't a language. It was a dense, layered sound of pure, raw emotion, a torrent of cold terror, deep sorrow, and profound, silent waiting. It was the sound of a million years of geological time, condensed and vocalized. I knew the sound was the memory of the rock, the trauma and stillness of the earth itself, now aware of my presence. The altar had awakened the system. I pushed forward, driven by the professional imperative. I set up a hydrophone, an underwater acoustic sensor, and recorded the sounds of the cave. The recordings were initially just the sound of my own breathing and the distant rush of water. But in the final recording, deep in the background, a new sound emerged, a rapid, continuous, metallic click click click. It sounded like a massive, antique clock, ticking with impossible speed. I realized the clock was the sound of the Earth's temporal mechanism, and the altar was the key to its internal workings. The entity was not a ghost, it was the consciousness of deep time. The final, terrifying encounter occurred at the deepest point of the system, a narrow squeeze I had to navigate. I was pushing my body and my tanks through the tight tunnel. The cold was overwhelming. The whisper of the walls was deafening now, a frantic, multi-layered roar of sorrow and silence. I finally cleared the squeeze and floated into a small, silent void. My headlamp illuminated the chamber. And there, resting on the floor, was a perfect, crystalline formation. It wasn't limestone. It was a massive, translucent, seven-sided crystal, pulsing with a faint, internal white light. It was positioned directly below a small, circular fracture in the ceiling of the cave. The crystal was the heart of the anchor. As I approached it, the water in the chamber began to turn murky. Not with silt, but with a fine, dark, particulate matter that flowed from the crystal, like ink dissolving in water. And then I saw the figure. It wasn't a ghost. It was a dense, three-dimensional negative space, a perfect, human-shaped void in the murky water, about 30 feet away. It was composed of pure, concentrated absence, a shape that absorbed all light and sound. The figure slowly began to glide toward me, its movement a smooth, unnatural slide through the water. It was coming from the crystal, its source of power. I was paralyzed. My breathing was ragged, my regulator sucking air frantically. As the figure approached, a single, clear, devastating thought was injected into my mind, louder than any whisper. You have measured the surface. You have disturbed the stone. You are a fragile vessel of warmth and chaos. The anchor requires stillness. Join the memory. The message wasn't a threat of death. It was an invitation to geological permanence, to become part of the cold, silent, collective consciousness of the Earth's crust. I knew I was about to be overwritten, my living mind replaced by the million-year sorrow of the stone. I looked at the crystal, the source of the murk and the figure's power. I had to break the connection. I grabbed the heavy, industrial-grade steel sampling hammer from my vest. I swam, kicking frantically, my knife hand steadying me against the current, until I was directly above the pulsing crystal. I swung the hammer down with all my strength, hitting the crystal dead center. The impact was shocking, a soundless, internal crack that resonated through my bones. The crystal shattered. The moment it broke, the negative space figure froze, shuddered violently, and then instantly imploded, folding in on itself into a single point of absolute, total blackness that vanished immediately. The murky water cleared instantly, reverting to its crystal-clear state. The immense pressure was gone. The whisper of the walls was silent. I left the cave immediately, abandoning all my remaining gear. I pushed myself out of the black shroud system and scrambled onto the bank, gasping in the humid Florida air. I never returned to cave diving. I retired, citing a permanent inner ear trauma. I now live in a small house, surrounded by light and noise. I work as a technical consultant, dealing only with surface-level geology. But every time I hear a clock ticking, I feel the cold fear return. I know that I only shattered the surface of the anchor. And sometimes, when I'm lying in bed, in the profound silence of 3 a.m., I feel a strange pressure in my eardrums. And I hear a faint, distant teach-um, the sound of the deep heart of the earth beginning to beat again, slowly, patiently, waiting for the next vessel to descend into the cold. Story 12. My name is Julian. I work as a forensic photographer for the Chicago Police Department. My job is to document death, the cold, hard facts of the crime scene. My world is one of light, lenses, and chemical development. I'm a man of reason, dealing only with the visible spectrum. The shift in my reality began when I started working on the old, undigitized archives, the film negatives from the 1970s and 80s. My darkroom is a sanctuary, a place of red light and chemical fumes. I was working on a series of cold cases, old homicides with no physical evidence left, but the original black and white negatives. The anomaly was entirely contained within the emulsion. The case was a notorious 1978 gang-related shooting. I was making prints from the original 4x5 negatives, large sheets of film with incredible detail. The scene was standard, a body on a slick, rain-dampened street. I pulled the first print from the developer bath, watched the image emerge under the safe light. The body was there. The chalk outline. The stark geometry of death. But as the image materialized, I saw a terrifying detail. The victim's eyes, dark, empty holes in the overexposed negative, seemed to possess a faint, internal glow. And they were looking in the wrong direction. The victim was shot facing the camera. His eyes, on the negative, were fixed on the lens. But the print revealed that his eyes were turned to the left, staring intensely at a spot just outside the frame. I pulled out the loupe, a powerful magnifying glass, and examined the negative directly. The victim's eyes, magnified 10 times, were clearly visible, staring past the point of the camera, fixed on something in the emulsion itself. I realized the camera hadn't just captured the light of the scene, it had captured the victim's final, fixed point of focus. The trauma was permanently bonded to the silver halide crystals. I called the phenomenon the negative gaze. The gaze became a constant. Every cold case negative I processed, from suicides to brutal murders, had the same characteristic. The victim's eyes, on the developing print, would be subtly shifted, no longer looking at the camera, but looking at a specific, fixed point in the scene, and often, looking out of the frame, directly at me. The eyes were no longer those of a dead person. They were the preserved, conscious witnesses of their own last seconds. The psychological toll was immense. I was surrounded by hundreds of pairs of silent, accusatory eyes, watching me from the darkness of the developing trays. The second anomaly was the shifting subject. The victims and the negatives began to move. Not physically, but within the frame's historical truth. I was processing a print of an old house fire homicide. The victim, a man, was lying near a charred window frame. I went to bed, leaving the negative clipped to the line to dry. I returned the next morning. The negative was dry. The image of the room was identical, but the victim was subtly relocated. His hand, which had been resting by his side, was now outstretched, palm up, reaching toward the center of the room. The subtle shift in position spoke of a desperate, final attempt to flee or to signal. I checked the master archive. My print showed the original position. The negative, however, showed the new position. The negative was rewriting the moment of death. The trauma, anchored to the silver, was trying to create a narrative of escape. I started a counter-ritual. I would spend hours in the darkroom, talking to the negatives, trying to figure out what they wanted. I was no longer a forensic photographer. I was a priest in a temple of the dead. The final, terrifying escalation occurred when the gaze left the film and entered my reflection. I was in the darkroom, the air thick with fixer and developer fumes. I had turned off the safe light and was working purely by feel, preparing the next batch of chemicals. The room was absolute, total blackness. Then I heard a faint, wet slapping sound, coming from the stainless steel sink filled with the spent chemicals. Slap. Slap. The sound of a hand being dipped and withdrawn from liquid. I froze. I knew I was alone. I turned on the safe light, a dim, blood-red glow. The sink was clean. The chemicals were still. I looked at the surface of the developer tray, which was a perfectly still pool of black liquid. And there, reflected in the surface of the liquid, was my face. But in the black reflection, my eyes were no longer looking at the tray. They were turned hard to the left, fixed on a point outside my field of vision, staring at the exact spot where the original 1978 victim had been looking. The negative gaze had transferred from the film to my own eyes. The victim, or whatever was trapped in the photo's trauma, was now looking through my eyes. And then, a silent thought, a sudden, cold injection of pure, focused hatred and terror, slammed into my mind. It wasn't a voice. It was the raw, sensory experience of being shot, the sharp, burning pain, the metallic taste of blood, and the final, absolute terror of the sudden end. I staggered back, vomiting onto the darkroom floor. I was on my knees, sobbing, the pain in my chest real and immediate. I knew the solution. I couldn't destroy the negatives. They were evidence. I couldn't exorcise the trauma. It was a physical artifact. I ran out of the darkroom, grabbed a can of industrial-grade fixer, the final, most stabilizing chemical, and poured the entire canister onto the floor of the darkroom. Then I threw the negatives, all the cold case archives, all the silent witnesses, into the caustic, stabilizing liquid. I was fixing the final lie. I was making the moment of death permanent, unchangeable, and eternally silent. The chemical reaction was violent. The room filled with a thick, choking, metallic fume. The negatives, submerged in the fixer, instantly surrendered their power. The shift stopped. The pain in my chest dissolved. The room became just a room, cold and chemical. I was fired a week later for the chemical contamination and destruction of the evidence. I never told them the truth. I am a portrait photographer now. I work only in natural light. I use only digital cameras. I refuse to use black and white film, and I never, ever enter a darkroom. But every time I take a photo, I check the digital display. And I look at the image of the subject's eyes. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I look at my own reflection in a window at night. And I force my eyes to turn, hard to the left, searching for that final, fixed point of trauma. Because I know that the dead are not interested in the light. They are interested in the permanence. And I am the only surviving negative that knows their final truth. Story 13. My name is Carl. I'm a structural engineer, and for the last 6 months, I was the project lead on the demolition of the old Kingfisher Railroad Bridge, a colossal, 1920s steel truss structure spanning a remote, sluggish section of the Missouri River. It was a massive, expensive job, and I'm a man who deals in tons of steel, cubic yards of concrete, and meticulous safety protocols. The last thing I expected was to find that the foundation of the bridge was built not on rock, but on human sacrifice. The demolition was methodical. We used massive cutting torches and precision explosives to take down the steel trusses. The final, and most challenging, part was the removal of the 3 colossal concrete piers, the bridge's supporting columns, anchored deep in the riverbed. The piers were solid, almost 30 feet wide. We drilled core samples for explosive placement. It was in the first pier, Pier Alpha, that we discovered the anomaly. The drills should have hit limestone. Instead, the bit ground against something hard and strangely brittle, something that wasn't rock. We brought in specialized thermal imaging equipment. The images showed a massive void inside the pier, a few feet above the water line, and inside the void, a dense, dark, oddly organic shape. We had to expose it. We set off small, directed charges to fracture the concrete surface. The concrete peeled away, revealing a cavity roughly the size of a small room. Inside the cavity, the air was cold, smelling intensely of iron, damp earth, and something sweet and chemical. The light from our work lamps illuminated the impossible truth. The cavity was not empty. It was filled with human remains, not skeletons, but perfectly preserved, mummified corpses, dressed in the rough clothing of 1920s laborers. There were 4 of them, arranged symmetrically, leaning against the cold, interior concrete walls. They hadn't fallen, they had been placed there. They were the foundation's original, silent sentinels. But the most terrifying discovery was in the center of the cavity. Rising from the floor and wrapping around the bodies, there was a massive, grotesque growth of what looked like living mycelium, a pale, thick, root-like network of fungal organism, interwoven with thick, black, human hair and long, fibrous strands of dried muscle tissue. It was a living biostructural anchor. I realized the bridge was built on a deliberate, ritualistic foundation, a historical phenomenon known as foundation sacrifice, where the lives of workers were intentionally sealed into the structure to grant it supernatural stability and strength. The bridge was not just concrete and steel. It was a vast, possessed structure. I called it the anchor bridge. The moment we exposed the cavity, the haunting began. The entire demolition site, which was usually loud with machinery and human noise, became submerged in a profound, unsettling silence. I stood on the pier, overseeing the structural safety measures. The only sound was the slow, sluggish movement of the river below. And then I heard the voices. They weren't coming from the exposed cavity. They were coming from the massive, inert mass of Pier Beta, the one that was still sealed. It was a chorus of grunts and strained whispers, the sound of men laboring under impossible weight. I heard the sound of a heavy sledgehammer against steel, the distinct thud of a bag of cement hitting the ground, and the choked, guttural gasps of men struggling to breathe. The sounds were precise, localized, and cyclical. It was the sound of the construction, eternally repeating inside the sealed concrete. The bridge was playing back the last moments of the men sealed inside. I pressed my ear against the cold, damp concrete of Pier Beta. The sound was deafening inside the material, a dense, rapid chorus of construction and despair. It was the collective consciousness of the men, now the sentient, tormented foundation of the bridge. The psychological pressure was unbearable. The bridge was communicating the reality of its history, trying to drive us away. The final, terrifying escalation was the organic resistance. We prepared to dismantle Pier Alpha, the one we had opened. We used diamond-tipped saws to cut into the concrete surrounding the cavity. As the saw blades sliced into the material, the air was instantly filled with a thick, sickly sweet odor, like decaying flowers and formaldehyde. And then, from the cavity, I saw the mycelium growth beginning to move. Slowly, deliberately, the thick, white fungal strands began to emerge from the walls, growing at an unnatural speed, reaching out toward the light of the exposed concrete. The saw operator screamed. His blade had hit something soft and spongy inside the pier. When he pulled it out, the steel was covered not with concrete dust, but with a dense, fibrous mass of hair and root structure. The pier was now actively defending itself. The biological anchor was consuming the concrete, making the pier a hybrid of human remains and sentient fungus. I realized the structure was not just haunted, it was possessed by a primordial, ancient intelligence that used human life as a form of architectural cement. I knew I had to destroy the core of the possession. I couldn't just cut the pier, I had to annihilate the organic anchor. I ordered the crew to stop work immediately. I descended into the cavity, armed with a high-powered, industrial-grade heat torch, the kind used for welding and metal cutting. I stood in the cold, dark room, surrounded by the mummified bodies and the writhing, white mycelium. The chorus of grunts and gasps from the sealed Pier Beta was deafening. I aimed the torch at the center of the cavity, at the nexus of the fungus and the black hair. I hit the trigger. The torch roared to life, a blast of intense, focused heat. The moment the flame touched the mycelium, the entire pier shrieked. It wasn't a sound, it was an internal, deep-pitched vibration that shook the entire bridge span, throwing me against the wall. The entire span of the bridge, the huge, inert steel trusses, began to groan and flex, as if a massive, sleeping animal had just been violently awakened. I kept the torch on the mycelium. The white organism smoked, then turned black and instantly crumbled into a fine, sterile ash. The smell was unbearable. The moment the last piece of fungus burned, the screaming stopped. The groan of the bridge ceased. The construction noises from Pier Beta vanished. The silence returned, heavy, profound, and absolute. I was pulled out of the cavity, choked by the fumes. I sealed the cavity with a quick-drying, self-sealing chemical foam, making the pier structurally sound but eternally sealed. I finished the demolition of the bridge 2 weeks later, using external explosives. The pier was the last to go, collapsing into the murky river with a colossal, final crash. I now work exclusively with modern steel structures. I refuse to work with concrete foundations. But I know I only destroyed the bridge, not the truth. The foundation sacrifice is an ancient ritual, and the earth is full of those silent anchors. And sometimes, when I'm walking across a modern, structurally perfect overpass, I feel a sudden, intense weight on my shoulders. And I hear a faint, distant tap-tap-tap of a sledgehammer, coming from the concrete beneath my feet. And I know the anchor bridge is still out there, its torment trapped in the concrete of 100 other structures. And the voices are waiting for the next engineer to drill too deep, to find the single, hidden flaw, the organic heart that holds the structure together. Story 14. My name is Finn. I'm an independent wildlife photographer, and my chosen life is one of voluntary isolation. I thrive on the silence and the cold. This past spring, I rented a remote fishing cabin in the deepest woods of northern Minnesota, miles from the nearest town. The cabin was a single-room, dilapidated structure on the edge of a small, cold lake. It was exactly the kind of austere environment I needed for my work. The cabin was owned by an old local named Elias. He was quiet, his eyes constantly darting, and he gave me a single, chilling instruction. The walls talk. Don't listen to them. And don't you ever cover them. I laughed it off as old-timer paranoia. But the moment I stepped inside, I understood. The cabin wasn't merely old. It was a physical archive of human madness. The walls, floor to ceiling, were covered in drawings and text. Not graffiti, but thousands of meticulously executed, overlapping votive scrawlings, a frantic, detailed, artistic record of paranoia and isolation. The drawings were all variations on the same theme: the eye in the sky, watching the trees, the spiral in the water, consuming the light, and the figure at the edge of the clearing, always faceless, always observing. The text was equally obsessive. Thousands of tiny, frantic words, all written in different hands, different colored pens, different languages. Fragments of prayer, technical specifications, desperate warnings, and philosophical questions. All of it repeated, over and over, until the wood was thick with ink. I realized this cabin was a place of absolute, forced memory. Every previous tenant had been driven to document their fears onto the only available surface. I called it the archive cabin. The paranoia started with the repetition. I was setting up my camera gear, trying to ignore the chaos on the walls. I noticed a single phrase, written near the door, repeated at least 50 times in small, cramped script. The lock is broken. The air is still. I checked the door. The ancient, rusty padlock was secured. The air was indeed perfectly still. I tried to scratch out the phrase with my knife, intent on erasing the previous tenant's obsession. I found myself unable to do it. My hand trembled, paralyzed by a sudden, intense sympathy for the person who had written it. I felt the pure, desperate need to document their truth. I spent the next 3 days doing no photography. I simply stared at the walls, trying to decipher the layers of fear. I noticed that the older drawings, faded and brittle, were being rewritten by the newer drawings, the frantic compulsion of the previous tenants passing to the next, like a form of psychic contagion. The second anomaly was the shifting narrative. I found a new drawing near the fireplace. It was an intricate, detailed portrait of the lake, drawn in red pencil. It showed a figure, faceless, male, standing on the dock, holding a fishing rod. The next morning, the drawing had subtly changed. The figure on the dock was still there, but now his hand was raised, holding not a fishing rod, but a sharp, pointed knife, aimed at his own throat. The narrative of the drawing had been violently, instantly overwritten. The drawing had predicted a violent, suicidal act. I checked the history of the cabin. The local records were sparse, but I found one note. 1994, Tenant John M. found deceased on the dock. Apparent self-inflicted injuries. The walls were not just recording the past. They were active, sentient archives that were constantly updating the narrative to reflect the deepest, most violent psychological truth of the location. The paranoia became intense. I started seeing the faceless figure in the drawings looking like me. I saw my own camera gear drawn into the frantic chaos. The walls were not just the records of other people's madness. They were a prediction of my own. The final, terrifying escalation was the invasive hand. I was sitting by the fire, my laptop open, trying to write an objective, scientific log of the paranoia. I was determined to resist the compulsion to scrawl on the walls. Then I looked down at my hands. They were trembling violently. I felt a sudden, profound, an alien compulsion to reach for the charcoal stick I kept near the fire pit. The impulse was so strong it felt like an electric current running through my muscles, overriding my rational thought. I fought the urge, clenching my fists. Then my hand, against my will, slowly unclenched. My fingers twitched, and my right index finger slowly began to trace a pattern on the wooden floor next to my boot. The pattern was the single, repeating, swirling spiral from the drawings, the symbol of the consuming water. My body was acting without my conscious permission, forced to contribute to the archive. I yelled, a desperate, raw sound of fear and violation. I threw myself back, away from my hand, as if it were a separate, possessed entity. I ran outside into the cold, clean air, gasping for breath. I stood in the clearing, staring at the cabin. The windows were dark, but the entire structure seemed to be vibrating with an internal, frantic hum. I realized the cabin was a spiritual filter. It attracted the most isolated, creative, and introspective souls, and then used the compulsion of self-documentation to extract their madness and shame, binding it to the physical structure. The old man's warning, "Don't cover them," was a literal command to not interrupt the archive's work. I knew the only way to break the cycle was to destroy the canvas. I ran back into the cabin, grabbed a gallon can of thick, white paint I had found in a supply closet, and a wide roller. I ignored the swirling whispers and the intrusive thoughts. I began to paint the walls, rapidly, frantically, covering the thousands of drawings, prayers, and desperate warnings with thick, bright, sterile white paint. The moment the paint covered the first wall, the reaction was immediate and violent. The wood of the walls began to groan, a deep, awful, visceral sound of structural agony. The drawings beneath the paint seemed to be bleeding through, the ink turning the white paint to a sickly, mottled pink and gray. The air in the room filled with the sound of 1,000 scribbling pens, a dense, chaotic chorus of frantic, high-pitched scratching, all directed at the white surface, desperately trying to redocument the erased memory. I kept painting, working faster, driven by a primal need to silence the archive. When the last wall was covered, a thick, white, pristine silence, the sound of the scribbling instantly stopped. The groaning ceased. The cabin was silent, a clean, blank slate. I walked out of the cabin and set the keys on the dock. I left my camera gear, my wallet, everything. I walked the 40 miles back to the nearest town, not looking back. I never returned to the woods. I now live in a city apartment, working as a simple delivery driver. I only use public transport. I still paint. I paint every day, but I only paint small, intricate, black and white patterns on small canvases. I am constantly working to control the creative compulsion. But every so often, when I'm working with a new tube of paint, I look at my hands. And I see a faint, almost invisible stain of permanent, crimson ink under my fingernails, a stain that will never wash out. And I know the archive cabin is out there, silent and white, waiting for the next tenant to enter its pristine, blank room. And I know that I didn't destroy the compulsion. I just transferred the archive to a new medium, the canvas of my own soul. And I am constantly, compulsively, drawing the spiral. Story 15. My name is Elijah. I'm a farmer. Not by choice, but by bloodline. I inherited the family farm, a sprawling, exhausted parcel of land in rural Kansas, after my father passed. It was a place of perpetual shadow and silence. My family's farm was an aesthetic contradiction, a classic, picturesque farmhouse surrounded by fields that were always slightly barren, the soil dark and overworked. The local community called our land Elijah's Folly, because for 200 years the farm had produced a meager yield, always just enough to survive, but never to thrive. The inheritance came with a covenant, a set of ancient, handwritten instructions left by my great-great-grandfather in the family Bible. They detailed a strict, bizarre schedule of crop rotation. There were 7 fields, and 7 specific crops. But there was one final, absolute rule. The 8th crop must never touch the soil of this land. Never plant the iron seed. The iron seed was a reference to winter rye, a common, hardy grain. The rule was nonsensical. Every other farm in the area grew rye. My father, and his father before him, had adhered to the rule out of a blend of superstition and resignation. I was a modern man. I was going to turn a profit. I decided to ignore the covenant and plant rye on field 7. I considered the ancient law to be the minor key of our family's agricultural failure. The moment I turned the earth on field 7 for the rye, the first anomaly began, the scent of the deep. The soil, which was normally dry and dusty, began to emit a thick, sickly sweet odor. It wasn't the smell of compost. It was a profound, suffocating scent of decaying vegetation and fresh, raw blood. The air was heavy with the smell of a million years of unburied organic matter. I tried to ventilate the area, but the smell only intensified, sticking to my clothes and penetrating my skin. The soil itself seemed to be breathing, exhaling the concentrated essence of its history. I planted the rye and waited. The crop grew with astonishing, unnatural speed. It was thick, dark, and impossibly green, the perfect, healthy harvest my land had never produced. The second anomaly was the sound of the harvest. The rye ripened in record time. I went out to the field at dusk to inspect the crop. The field was silent, waiting for the combine. But as I walked through the towering stalks, I heard a faint, sibilant sound coming from the base of the plants, from inside the earth. It was a chorus of whispers, not in English, but in a language that sounded like dry leaves rustling and tiny, hungry mouths chewing. I knelt down and put my ear to the ground. The whispering intensified, becoming a unified, cold demand. It is ripe. It is time. We are hungry. I realized the rye was not just a plant, it was a conduit. By planting the forbidden crop, I had created a perfect medium for whatever had been lying dormant under my land for 2 centuries, a subterranean entity, an ancient earth demon, that used the iron-rich soil and the forbidden grain as its primary means of communication and consumption. The earth demon was not interested in my soul. It was interested in the perpetual cycle of energy, the eternal debt of the harvest. The psychological toll was one of total, overwhelming dread. I was not a farmer. I was a caretaker for an entity that lived in the dark. The final, terrifying escalation was the appearance of the votive. The day before the harvest, I was standing on the porch, looking out at the incredibly dense, black field of rye. I saw a single figure standing at the edge of the field. It was my father. He was standing motionless, wearing his old overalls, his face pale and fixed in an expression of profound sorrow. "Father!" I yelled, running toward the field. As I approached, the figure did not move. It was a perfect, three-dimensional imprint of my father, woven from the darkness of the dense rye stalks. It was a physical manifestation of the trauma, the embodiment of the guilt that came with breaking the covenant. The figure slowly raised its arm and pointed down at the ground, at the base of a single rye stalk. I stopped at the edge of the field. I was terrified of entering the dense, dark thicket. I saw the stalk he was pointing at. It was unnaturally large. And wrapped around the base of the stalk was a single, brittle, dried ribbon, a small, familiar piece of fabric. It was the blue ribbon my mother had given me as a child. The earth demon was not just using the ghost of my father, it was using my personal, irreplaceable memory as an offering, a psychological votive to increase its power. The harvest was not just grain, it was the sum of our family's sorrow. I knew I had to stop the harvest and break the cycle of the covenant. I couldn't destroy the field with fire. That was what the demon wanted, the intense heat of a ritual sacrifice. I grabbed the only tool I knew, the disc harrow, a heavy piece of equipment designed to chop and break up the soil. I drove the tractor out to field 7 at midnight, the engine roaring, a defiance of the field's silence. I engaged the disc harrow. The sharp, heavy blades sliced into the dense stalks of rye, tearing the grain and turning the black soil. The moment the blades hit the earth, the reaction was apocalyptic. The field shrieked. The sound was a fusion of the thousand whispers and the sudden, physical sound of massive roots being violently torn from the ground. The entire tractor began to shake violently. I looked back. The rye stalks were writhing, not from the motion of the harrow, but from an internal, organic force, as if the plants themselves were trying to resist the destruction. I kept driving, tearing the field to ribbons. Then, from the tilled earth, a massive, foul-smelling cloud of black dust erupted, filling the air. The black dust was the essence of the earth demon, expelled from the shattered soil. The dust cloud roared around the tractor, and through the haze, I saw the face of my father, huge and sorrowful, formed from the black particles. "You have broken the contract, Elijah! The hunger is eternal. The penalty is the root. You are the final harvest." The vision faded. The dust cloud settled, and the field was left in ruins, a chaotic, broken mess of shattered stalks and freshly turned, silent soil. The rye was dead. The demon was banished from its anchor. I sold the farm a month later. I now work in a clean, brightly lit feed supply store in a city. I deal only with packaged, sterile product. But I know I only destroyed the crop. I didn't destroy the covenant. I still have a deep aversion to the color black. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I look at my hands. And I see that the soil under my fingernails, no matter how much I clean them, is perpetually dark, rich, and impossibly black. And I know the earth demon is still out there, riding the agricultural currents of the continent, looking for a new farmer, a new ritual, and a new seed. And I am forever bound to the logic of the covenant, forever searching for a clean field that has never touched the iron seed. Story 16. My name is Robert Vance. I'm a night security guard at the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C. My job is a solemn one, to patrol the vast, marble halls from midnight to dawn, ensuring that the millions of artifacts remain untouched. It's an easy gig, generally. I walk, I log, I listen to the silence. I am a man of routine. The haunting I experienced was not of a lonely ghost, but of a collective, bureaucratic terror, the spirits of the museum's most obsessed curators, who are eternally trapped in their domain and dedicated to the absolute, unwavering preservation of the collection. The trouble started, specifically, in the American Wing, a massive, high-ceilinged hall filled with dioramas, historical garments, and preserved relics from colonial times to the 19th century. The atmosphere here was always the coldest, the air heavy with the smell of old formaldehyde and dry paper. The first anomaly was the shifting exhibits. I was doing my 2 a.m. round. I passed the famous colonial kitchen diorama, a life-sized reconstruction of a 1750s home interior, complete with wax figures. I logged the scene, kitchen normal. 20 minutes later, I passed it again on my return route. The scene was subtly, impossibly altered. A ceramic jug, which had been resting on the table, was now positioned perfectly in the exact center of the mantelpiece. A heavy, antique ladle, which had been hanging on a hook, was now placed precisely on the floor, next to the wax figure of the colonial woman. The changes were not destructive, they were recuratorial. The items were being moved with meticulous, profound care, as if a highly focused, invisible mind was constantly rearranging the exhibit to achieve a silent, internal perfection. I checked the motion sensors. Nothing. I checked the video logs. The camera was filled with static during the 20-minute window. I realized the museum was possessed by the spirits of the long-dead curators, driven mad by their eternal, unfinishable task. They were the silent curators, and they were constantly, methodically, and invisibly working. The second anomaly was the judgment of the log. I kept a digital log of my observations. I meticulously described the shifting exhibits, trying to maintain a clinical, professional tone. One night, I finished my log entry, closed the tablet, and continued my patrol. I returned 10 minutes later, opening the log to check my spelling. My entry was still there. But directly underneath my text, a new, single line had been inserted, typed in a small, perfect font that was not part of the standard system. Observation flawed. The jug is not resting. It is presented. Clarify terminology, curator. The message was not a threat. It was a correction, a precise, professional judgment on my work. The silent curators were monitoring my log, and they were infuriated by my lack of precision. The psychological warfare was subtle, the constant pressure to be perfect, to achieve the impossible standard of the eternally vigilant dead. I started spending hours on each log entry, agonizing over the placement of commas and the precise verb choice. My job was no longer to guard the museum. It was to serve the archive. The final, terrifying escalation was the acquisition. I was in the basement storage area, a vast labyrinth of forgotten, unexhibited items. I was doing a final security check on a heavy, iron-gated vault. As I approached the vault, the air grew intensely cold, smelling of old, thick velvet and dried insect repellent. I heard the sound. Not the scraping of the walls, but a series of distinct, slow, rhythmic footsteps on the concrete floor, coming from inside the locked vault. Step, pause, step. I pressed my ear against the cold iron gate. The footsteps stopped. They were replaced by a quiet, focused, straining sound, the noise of someone struggling to move something immensely heavy. And then, a smooth, elderly voice, perfectly calm and deeply cultured, spoke directly through the metal of the door. Your form is acceptable. The frame is structurally sound. You will make a most excellent centerpiece for the new wing. We require a subject of modern. Lived in fear. You are the perfect acquisition. The voice was not malicious. It was simply procedural. The curators were preparing the final exhibit, and I was to be the newest piece, a living diorama of a security guard's descent into psychological trauma. I knew the vault contained the most dangerous item in the museum, the preserved remains of the original curator, Professor Alistair, who had died in the museum in 1904, demanding that his body be preserved to eternally oversee the perfection of the collection. The curators had joined him, and they were now preparing to add me to the permanent collection. I backed away from the vault. I knew I couldn't run out. They were everywhere. I had to out-curate the curators. I ran back to the American wing, to the colonial kitchen diorama, the first place I had seen the shifting exhibits. I grabbed the heavy, antique ladle from the floor. I ran to the wax figure of the colonial woman, which was frozen in a pose of polite, silent suffering. I smashed the ladle against the wax head of the figure. The impact was shocking. The head shattered, the wax and internal armature collapsing onto the floor. The response was instantaneous and violent. The entire museum shrieked, not with a ghostly wail, but with a sound of pure, administrative horror, the sound of a priceless artifact being destroyed. The lights in the American wing began to flicker violently, the glass in the display cases rattling. The air was filled with 1,000 whispers of damage, violation, catastrophe. I stood over the ruined wax figure. I had not damaged the exhibit. I had committed heresy against their preservation mandate. I had given them chaos. I dropped the ladle and ran for the main doors. I didn't stop until I was out in the cold, clear air of the Washington morning. I was fired immediately, of course, for the willful destruction of historical artifacts. The official report cited an unspecified break-in to cover the damage. I now work as a furniture mover. I deal only with items that have no history, no aesthetic value, and no preservation mandate. But every time I walk through a doorway, I pause. And I check the positioning of my keys, my wallet, and my phone. I look for the subtle, meticulous rearrangement of my personal items. And I know the silent curators are still out there, riding the energy of order and preservation. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I hear a soft, dry voice in the silence, correcting my own thoughts. Log flawed. The man is not moving. He is relocating. Clarified terminology, acquisition. And I know the final exhibit is still waiting for me. I am perpetually uncurated, but eternally monitored. Story 17. My name is Ethan Keller. I'm a private investigator, specializing in missing persons cases, usually the grim, mundane sort. My current case was the disappearance of Marcus Thorne, a successful financial analyst who vanished from a major Chicago hotel one rainy Tuesday night. The case was dead-ended. No witnesses, no forced entry, just a neatly made bed and a cancelled meeting. The last trace of Thorn led to the Blackstone Tower Hotel, an imposing, Gothic skyscraper in the city's loop, built in 1929. The building was old, grand, and full of secrets. My investigation led me to the hotel's blueprints, secured in the city planning office. That's where the architectural anomaly began. The original blueprints listed the floors from 1 to 12, then immediately skipped to 14. The 13th floor was non-existent, an architectural suppression designed to appease superstition. I looked at the elevator shaft schematic. The physical structure of the building had no break in the elevator shaft between the 12th and 14th floors. It was a solid, continuous column. I realized the answer to Thorn's disappearance lay in the architectural lie. The missing floor was the anchor point for the hotel's unseen reality. I called the anomaly the phantom floor. My next step was obvious. I booked a room at the Blackstone, got to know the night staff, and spent my evenings observing the main elevator bank. The main elevator was a massive, antique brass cage. I would ride it repeatedly between the 10th and 15th floors. For the first few nights, nothing. Then, around 3 a.m. on a Friday, the elevator was empty. I hit the 15th floor button. The car started its ascent. As we passed the space between the 12th and 14th floors, the elevator car began to shudder violently. The lights flickered, and the antique mechanism emitted a high-pitched, metallic groan of resistance. The small, brass indicator dial above the door, which was stuck between 12 and 14, suddenly jumped back, settling perfectly on a spot with no number. The dial was resting on the physical space of the 13th floor. The elevator doors, however, remained sealed. The car was trapped. The air in the cage turned intensely cold, smelling of stale cigar smoke and old, dry paper, the faint scent of a 1920s office. I reached out and pressed the door release button. The motor whined, but the doors wouldn't budge. Then, from outside the cage, I heard a sound. A single, distinct, rhythmic tap-tap-tap of a key being struck on a typewriter, muffled by the concrete shaft. I pressed my ear against the brass bars. The sound was coming from a short distance away, through the wall, from a space that did not exist. I realized the phantom floor was not empty. It was a functioning office, perpetually trapped in the decade of its architectural creation. I was not just trapped in the elevator. I was positioned right next to the office of the person who had managed to enter the invisible space. The terrifying realization was that the missing businessman, Marcus Thorn, had not left the hotel. He had simply been rerouted to the 13th floor. The second anomaly was the shifting wall. The next night, I was back on the elevator, ready. When it stopped at the phantom floor, I had a custom-made metal shim ready. I managed to force the brass cage door open a sliver, just enough to see into the elevator shaft. The space was pure, dark concrete. But as I watched, the concrete wall a few feet in front of me began to ripple, like water under pressure. The surface of the wall dissolved into a swirling vortex of shimmering white noise, and for a split second, I saw what was behind the wall, a glimpse of a narrow hallway, dimly lit by an ornate, dusty ceiling lamp. I saw a line of black, polished brass plaques on the wooden doors, all identical, with numbers that did not exist: 1301, 1302, 1303. The wall was not solid. It was a temporal veil. The 13th floor existed in a separate, isolated timeline, anchored to the physical space of the building, and the shifting wall was the precise, momentary point of its temporal bleed. As the wall shimmered, a single, folded piece of paper fluttered through the gap, landing on the floor of the elevator cage. The concrete wall snapped back to solid reality, and the elevator continued its ascent to the 14th floor. I snatched the paper. It was thick, yellowed, and smelled of old cigar smoke. It was a memo, typed in an antiquated font, addressed to all proprietors, and dated October 19, 1933. The subject: retention of premises and non-compliance protocol. The message was clear. Those who vanished did so because they tried to leave the hotel, or failed to comply with the hidden rules of the 13th floor. Thorn was a non-compliant proprietor. The final, terrifying escalation was the hand on the indicator. I returned to the elevator one final time. I was not there to find Thorn. I was there to confirm the nature of the entity that controlled the floor. I waited until the car stopped at the phantom floor. The indicator dial settled on the blank space. I looked at the dial. The brass was shiny, polished. Then, a dark, viscous liquid began to seep slowly out of the central axle of the dial. It was black, thick, and smelled of stale machine oil. As I watched, the liquid coagulated and formed a shape, a thick, articulated finger, which slowly moved across the brass face of the indicator dial. The finger moved with agonizing slowness, tracing a path, and then it tapped the exact location of the phantom floor on the dial. A single, sharp clink of metal on metal. The movement was followed by a low, dry, authoritative voice that spoke through the metal of the cage door. "The lease is perpetual, investigator. The non-compliance protocol is active. We require an executive for the new suite. The elevator is now open for your inspection." The finger dissolved back into the black liquid. And with a smooth, quiet hiss, the main brass elevator doors slowly, majestically slid open, revealing the dimly lit hallway of the 13th floor. I was staring directly into the narrow, dusty hallway of the 1933 office suite. The air was cold, and the sound of the rapid, frantic typewriter was deafening. I could see the polished brass plaques on the doors. I knew that one step out, and the temporal veil would close behind me, trapping me forever as the new proprietor of a phantom office. I didn't move. I forced myself to look at the open door, then at the numbers above the door. I reached out and slammed the button for the ground floor. The doors hissed closed with surprising speed. The elevator car dropped violently, the indicator dial spinning wildly. I exited the Blackstone Hotel and never looked back. I filed a full report with the Chicago PD, citing severe health issues, and attaching the 1933 memo as an historical curiosity. I now work exclusively with digital cold cases, dealing only with intangible data. I refuse to enter any building constructed before 1980. But I know the truth. The Blackstone Tower is a silent, temporal trap. And sometimes, when I'm riding a modern, well-lit elevator, it will suddenly shudder, and the lights will flicker. I instinctively look at the numbered display. And I wait for the number to settle on the impossible, terrifying sequence, 13. And I know that somewhere in the dark, silent heart of the Chicago Loop, the typewriter is still tapping, and the proprietors of the phantom floor are waiting for the next investigator to get too curious about the single, necessary lie of a very old building. Story 18. My name is Dr. Elias Vance. I am a meteorological physicist, and my work is dedicated to understanding the logic of the atmosphere. For the past 6 months, I have been the sole resident of the Arctic Research Outpost 7, ARO-7, a small, highly isolated geodesic dome anchored to a permanent sheet of ice deep within the Arctic Circle. My assignment was to study magnetic field distortion and atmospheric chemistry. The isolation here is absolute, the darkness almost perpetual, and the silence is a physical presence. The landscape is a flat, endless expanse of white and black, a truly minimalist aesthetic that was supposed to be conducive to pure thought. The problem I encountered was not meteorological. It was metaphysical. It was the discovery that the frigid, high-altitude wind itself was a collective, sentient archive of human agony. The first anomaly was the voice in the wind. I was outside, checking the sensor arrays. The wind was a constant, high-pitched shriek, a sound that quickly becomes white noise. But tonight the sound was different. Amidst the constant shriek, I heard a distinct, articulate human voice. It was a woman's voice, high-pitched and strained, speaking in a language I recognized as Norwegian. The voice was clearly stating one word: "Hjelp! Help!" I immediately checked my communication logs. No incoming radio traffic, no rogue satellites. The sound was coming from the atmosphere itself, riding the chaotic wave of the polar wind. I brought the phenomenon inside, using a highly sensitive, parabolic acoustic dish. The dish filtered out the white noise of the storm, focusing the sound wave. The recording was terrifying. It was a dense, overlapping chorus of hundreds of voices, male, female, young, and old, all speaking different words in different languages, all simultaneously compressed onto the single sonic medium of the wind. The message was not a signal, it was an atmospheric archive. I realized the wind was picking up and eternally circulating the last, desperate cries of all the people who had died of exposure, shipwreck, or isolation in the history of the Arctic. The cold wind was the language of the dead. I started calling the entity the carrier. The second anomaly was the emotional injection. The carrier began to communicate not just through sound, but through emotion. I was sitting in my sterile lab, analyzing a core sample, when a sudden, overwhelming wave of profound grief hit me. It wasn't my grief. It was vast, cold, and impersonal, the sorrow of having one's life cut short, of a loss without witness or burial. The wave lasted 10 minutes, leaving me physically shaking and drained. I checked the sensor logs. The moment the emotional wave hit me, the static electricity in the air outside the dome registered a massive, unexplainable spike. The wind was not just carrying the sounds of the dead, it was carrying their final, raw, unprocessed emotional energy, and discharging it onto the only living human present. I theorized that the extreme magnetic conditions of the pole were allowing this non-human, collective consciousness to breach the fragile barrier of my own psyche. The minimalist, clean environment of the Arctic was amplifying the metaphysical chaos. The psychological pressure was immense. I became terrified of the wind, the very medium of my study. I started wrapping myself in blankets, trying to create an emotional insulator, but the fear of the next cold, crushing wave of alien sorrow was constant. The final, terrifying escalation was the architectural contradiction. I was outside during a rare calm period, checking the dome's structural integrity. I looked up at the vast, silent sky, filled with the faint, cold glow of the stars. The wind picked up, a sudden, sharp gust that hit me like a physical blow. The voice returned, loud and authoritative, speaking in my own native tongue, a single, clear, devastating sentence. "Your geometry is false, Elias. The dome is a temporary illusion. The silence is the only truth. You are the last one to be collected." The message shattered my sense of reality. I looked at the geodesic dome, the perfect, logical structure of my sanctuary. Then, I looked at the snow immediately around the base of the dome. The wind had scoured the snow, leaving the dome's foundation exposed. But instead of a perfect circle, the pattern of the foundation, where the metal met the ice, was a subtle, complex 13-sided polygon. The architects had built a subtle, impossible asymmetry into the foundation, and the wind had meticulously exposed the flaw. I realized the wind wasn't a natural phenomenon. It was a vast, cold, metaphysical cleaner, dedicated to destroying the chaotic, illogical structures of human endeavor. The voice was the cold, logical mind of the infinite void. I knew I had to escape. The carrier was closing in. I had to use the one thing the wind couldn't carry: heat. I didn't try to send a distress signal. I ran into the dome and grabbed the industrial-grade, propane-fueled ground-thawing unit, a massive torch used to melt the permafrost. I carried the torch outside and aimed it directly at the physical seam between the dome's foundation and the ice, the 13-sided, geometrically flawed anchor point. I hit the trigger. The torch roared to life, a blast of intense, focused heat against the cold. The moment the flame hit the ice, the reaction was immediate and violent. The wind screamed, a physical, sonic blast that shattered the thick windows of the dome and knocked me off my feet. The parabolic acoustic dish exploded into a million pieces. The immense pressure of the atmosphere slammed into me. I felt the collective emotional wave of the carrier hit me one last time, a paralyzing, final wave of cold, infinite sorrow that felt like my very blood was freezing in my veins. I kept the torch on the ice, melting the structural seam. The ice turned to water, and the foundation began to slip. The sound of the wind slowly, agonizingly, began to fade. The emotional wave receded. The carrier was being cut off from its terrestrial anchor. I abandoned the torch and scrambled onto the evacuation snowmobile. I drove hard for 70 miles toward the nearest established route, not looking back. The AR-07 dome was lost to the ice. I was rescued 2 days later, suffering from severe frostbite and hypothermia. I was discharged from the program, citing psychological breakdown. I live in Southern California now. I teach in a university, focusing on the simple, predictable nature of water vapor. I keep the heating cranked high, and I refuse to turn on the air conditioning. But I know I only fled the anchor. And sometimes, when I'm walking on a cold night, I feel a sudden, sharp gust of wind whip past me, completely localized, completely unnatural. And I hear a faint, distant whisper, carrying the chilling, clear, logical voice. We are still waiting, Elias. The data is archived. The silence is perpetual. The correction is inevitable. And I know that the cold, intelligent wind of the Arctic is always waiting for the slightest breath, the smallest silence, to communicate the final, crushing truth, that the only real structure is the geometric perfection of the void. Story 19. My name is Kevin. I'm a custodian, a janitor, if you want the honest term, working the night shift at the Willow Creek Elementary School. It's a classic, sprawling brick building in the suburbs of Connecticut, built in the 1950s. My shift runs from 11 p.m. to 6 a.m. The building is usually a symphony of silence, fluorescent hums, and the distant drip of pipes. The core of the haunting here is focused on the playground. The playground is adjacent to the old schoolyard, a vast expanse of asphalt and grass, dominated by a huge, iron swing set and a wooden merry-go-round. The school has a tragic history, a bus accident in 1965 that claimed the lives of 3 children during recess. The haunting was not subtle, it was a perpetual recess. It started with the swings. I would be inside, mopping the main hall, around 1 a.m. I would hear it, the distinct rhythmic, metallic creak of the old swing set, coming from the empty playground. Creak, pause, creak. I would check the windows. The swings were indeed moving. Not wildly, but slowly, rhythmically, with a perfect, unnerving synchronicity. 3 swings, moving at the same pace, with the precise, practiced motion of 3 children sitting on them. I would go outside, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The moment my light hit the playground, the swings would stop. Instantly. They would hang motionless, silent, the chains no longer swaying, as if the children had instantly lifted their feet and vanished. I realized the playground was an anchor for the spirits of the lost children. They were forever trapped in the moment of their final, shared happiness, eternally playing in the shadow of their death. The second anomaly was the sound of the games. As I continued my nightly rounds, the presence became auditory. I would hear the high-pitched, chaotic, and terrifying sounds of children playing, coming from the empty hallways and the sealed gymnasium. I heard the quick, rhythmic thump-thump-thump of a basketball bouncing in the gym, followed by a chorus of high-pitched, triumphant laughter. I heard the frantic, close whispers of hide-and-seek, right at the end of the long, dark corridor. I heard the sharp, frantic screaming of tag, right outside the cafeteria door. But the screams were always cut short, ending in a chilling, guttural hiccup, replaced by a profound, immediate silence. The games were not just being played, they were being interrupted at the moment of the accident. I used my industrial floor buffer, trying to drown out the sounds, but the laughter of the children would pierce through the roar of the machine, cold and clear. The fear was that the games were turning vicious, and the children were looking for a 4th player. The final, terrifying escalation occurred with the spinning merry-go-round. I was in the teacher's lounge, checking the clock. It was 3:15 a.m., the approximate time of the 1965 accident. I looked out the window at the playground. The huge iron merry-go-round, which was always locked in place with a heavy chain, was spinning. It was spinning slowly, relentlessly, with a grinding, metallic groan that was distinct from the silence. It was spinning with an immense, palpable effort. I ran outside, flashlight in hand. As I approached the playground, the spinning increased, the metallic groan turning into a high-pitched shriek. In the center of the spinning ride, I saw them, 3 small shadows, dense and dark, woven from the black air, sitting on the iron seats. They were moving their feet, perpetually pushing against the ground, forcing the ancient mechanism to turn. And then, one of the shadow children stopped pushing. It turned its small, oblong head toward me, directly into the light beam. A single, high-pitched, clear voice, full of desperate longing, spoke from the turning ride. "We need one more, Mr. Kevin. The number is wrong. Your IT. Get on, Mr. Kevin. The recess is waiting." The message wasn't a threat, it was an invitation to the eternal game. The children were trapped in the chaotic, joyful moment of their end, and they needed a final, living playmate to complete the tragic geometry of their accident. I knew I couldn't stop the spinning. I couldn't join the game. I had to break the anchor. I ran back into the school and down to the janitorial closet. I found a massive bag of rock salt, the kind used for melting ice on the walkways. I ran back out to the playground. The merry-go-round was still spinning, the shadows fixed on me. I aimed the bag of rock salt at the central axle of the ride and ripped the bag open. I poured the entire contents, a dense, white cascade, directly onto the ground beneath the spinning iron. The moment the rock salt hit the ground, the spinning seized up. The grinding metal stopped with a violent, final screech of friction. The shadows on the seats dissolved instantly, collapsing into the darkness. The entire playground went silent. The air was cold, but the oppressive feeling of endless play was gone. The recess was over. I left the school immediately, handing in my keys and badge at the police station. I never went back. I now work as a groundskeeper at a small, private botanical garden. I deal only with living, predictable, growing things. I avoid all metal structures. But I know I only stopped the ride. I didn't save the children. And sometimes, when I'm walking on a cold, silent night, I hear a faint, distant, rhythmic creak coming from a place I can't locate. And I know the swings are still moving. And I know the children are still playing their games, waiting for the day I slip up and let the sound of their laughter draw me into the darkness. Because the final, terrible lesson of the playground is that every game is an eternal loop, and every silence is just waiting for the sound of a new voice to begin the next round of tag. Story 20. My name is Noah. I was a volunteer search and rescue specialist for FEMA, a man who thrives on crisis, logic, and meticulous procedure. My most harrowing assignment was a town called Haven's End, a small farming community in coastal Louisiana that had been entirely evacuated due to a catastrophic, overnight hurricane and flood warning. My team was sent in to conduct a final, post-evacuation sweep. When we reached the town, the anomaly was immediate. The massive hurricane had veered away at the last minute. The predicted flood never came. Haven's End was physically intact, but completely empty. No cars, no people, no pets. The houses were locked, the lights were off, and the silence was profound. It was a town that had been meticulously removed from reality. I called the phenomenon the evacuation. My team and I began the search, methodically clearing house after house. It quickly became clear that the residents hadn't just left, they had been erased. In every house, the anomaly was the same. The table was set for dinner, the coffee was in the pot, the television was still warm to the touch. But the photographs were gone. Every framed photo, every album, every digital image on a screen was completely blank, a uniform field of static or bleached white. The visual record of their lives was erased. I logged the findings, unnerved but maintaining my professional composure. This was a massive, collective psychotic break, a cult-like mass disappearance. The second anomaly was the final broadcast. In the town hall, which served as the local emergency operations center, I found the evidence that shattered my rational theory. The command center was pristine. On a central desk, a single, antique reel-to-reel tape recorder sat, the spools stationary, the record light blinking faintly. I rewound the tape and pressed play. The recording was not static. It was the clear, desperate voice of the town's elderly mayor, Mayor Peterson, recorded approximately 24 hours prior. "The storm is turning. The water level is falling. The forecast is wrong. I'm telling the council to send the bus back. The evacuation is over. We're safe. The recording continued, with the mayor issuing calm, clear instructions for the residents to return to their homes. Then the tape skipped, and Mayor Peterson's voice returned, now a desperate, tight whisper. They didn't come back. I saw them. They drove the buses and cars back, but they didn't stop. They drove right through the center of town. They were looking straight ahead. They were empty. Just the shells of the people. They drove the empty cars back to the houses, parked them neatly, and then they all stopped. The tape ended abruptly with a short, metallic screech, the sound of a microphone being violently dropped. I realized the town wasn't emptied by a flood. It was emptied by a reverse evacuation. Something had driven the empty shells of the residents back to their homes, and then systematically deleted them from the visual spectrum, leaving only their physical presence, their cars, and their belongings. The chilling truth was that the town was not abandoned. It was occupied by the emptiness of its former residents. The final, terrifying escalation was the mirror of the lost. I was in the mayor's private office, alone, with the reel-to-reel recorder. The air was cold, oppressive, and smelled of ozone and damp earth. I looked at the window. The reflection was normal, my tired face, the messy office behind me. Then, a faint, rippling distortion appeared in the glass, radiating from the center of the window. The distortion cleared, and the reflection changed. It wasn't my office. It was the exact same office, but it was filled with people. The mayor, the council, the secretary. They were all standing rigid, silent, and motionless, staring directly at the reflection of the glass. They were shadows, perfect, three-dimensional figures woven from pure, solid blackness, like dense carbon smoke. They were the original residents, and they were trapped in the perpetual moment of their final, organized disappearance. The mayor, the central shadow figure, slowly lifted his hand and pointed not at me, but at the tape recorder. Then, a single, deep, calm voice, the mayor's voice, spoke from the reflection, clear and profound. The record is flawed, son. The truth is in the emptiness. The flood was not water. It was the silence that rushed in and took us. The tape is the last memory. You must destroy the record. Join the silence. The figure was inviting me to erase the final piece of evidence and join the town in its permanent, empty, ordered silence. I knew I had to run. I snatched the reel-to-reel tape, the sole audio record of the event, and ran out of the town hall. I drove out of Haven's End, the town looking perfectly normal in my rearview mirror, utterly silent and waiting. I was debriefed, my report filed as mass psychological trauma and cult-induced exodus. I kept the tape. I now work as a simple archivist, dealing with historical documents, tangible, physical records that cannot be erased by a single mental command. But I know the truth. The flood that took Haven's End was the cosmic silence, a force that meticulously deletes all unnecessary human chaos. I still have the tape. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I put the tape on my own personal recorder and press play. I don't listen to the mayor's voice. I listen for the final, sudden screech at the end. And I know that somewhere, out there in the empty, silent town, the shadows are waiting. And they are listening for the day I decide to erase the last, single piece of evidence, and the silence rushes out of the speaker to consume me.